Most storytellers think a great villain is a strong villain. The logic makes sense on the surface. If a villain is more powerful than the hero, the threat feels real, the stakes feel high, the audience leans forward. Power is the easiest way to establish danger. But power alone has never made a villain unforgettable. Think about the ones you've actually forgotten. Chances are, many of them were described as the most powerful enemy the protagonist had ever faced. Chances are, they had abilities that dwarfed anything the hero could match. They had armies, or superior intelligence, or a godlike understanding of physics, or some ancient power that had never been defeated before. And you don't remember them. Not really. You remember that they existed. You remember that there was a big battle at the end. But you don't think about their philosophy. You don't feel anything when someone mentions their name. They were powerful, and they lost, and the story moved on, and so did you. Now think about the ones you do remember. Think about the villains who genuinely stayed with you. Not the ones with the most screen time. Not the ones with the most impressive powers. The ones whose specific logic you can still reconstruct. Whose worldview you understood so well that you could imagine what they would think about something happening right now, in the real world. Those villains were rarely the strongest. What they were was the most coherent. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Great villains don't need to be powerful. They need to be comprehensible. Their internal logic needs to be clear enough that you can follow it, and complete enough that you can extrapolate it beyond the story. If you can understand why a villain does what they do, not just what they do, but why, then they become real to you in a way that transcends the story. They stop being characters and start being people. And people stay with us in ways that characters simply don't. There's another common mistake storytellers make when building antagonists. They confuse obstacles with enemies. An obstacle is something that gets in the way. A locked door is an obstacle. A storm is an obstacle. A villain who simply wants to stop the hero from achieving their goal without any deeper motivation of their own is also an obstacle. They just happen to have a face and a name. Obstacles can be dramatic. They can create tension. They can be visually spectacular, but they don't haunt you. You don't think about a locked door at 2 in the morning. You don't find yourself reconstructing a storm's internal logic while you're in the shower. A true villain is not an obstacle. A true villain has their own story, their own goals, their own reason for existing that doesn't depend on the hero at all. In fact, the best villains would be doing exactly what they're doing even if the hero had never been born. That's a crucial distinction. When a villain's existence is entirely defined by their opposition to the protagonist, they become a mirror, a reflection of the hero without any independent existence. They rise when the hero rises, they fall when the hero falls, and when the story ends, they vanish completely. There's nothing left of them because there was never anything there beyond the opposition. But when a villain has their own complete interior life, their own wounds, their own philosophy, their own version of the world that they're trying to build or protect, then they persist. They exist outside the hero. They would exist outside the story if you could follow them home at the end of an episode and keep watching. Those are the villains you remember because they feel like they're still out there somewhere, doing what they do for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the hero exists. Rick and Morty understood this instinctively from very early in its run. The show is built, at its structural core, around a character who is already a kind of villain in the traditional sense. Rick Sanchez, the smartest person in the universe, who treats the world as a playground and other people as inconveniences. And because the show puts you so firmly inside Rick's perspective for so much of its runtime, you come to understand him with a depth that most protagonists don't receive, let alone antagonists. That understanding becomes important, because when Rick and Morty eventually introduces characters who oppose Rick, characters who challenge his worldview, threaten what he values, or reflect back something about him that he'd rather not see, the audience is positioned to feel those encounters in a very specific way. You're not just watching a hero face a villain. You're watching a version of someone you understand face something that your understanding of them tells you genuinely threatens them. That's a very different emotional experience, and it's one that almost no other animated series has managed to create with quite the same precision. Let's talk about what actually makes audiences emotionally connect with antagonists, because this is where most analysis gets lazy. The standard explanation is that you connect with a villain when they have a sympathetic backstory, when they were wronged, when you understand the chain of events that turned them into what they are. The tragic origin story model of villain construction. This model works sometimes, but it's not sufficient, and it's not even necessary. Some of the most memorable villains in storytelling history have no sympathetic backstory at all. They're simply who they are, for reasons that feel complete, without requiring you to feel sorry for them. What actually creates emotional connection is something different: investment in outcome. You connect with a villain emotionally when you have a genuine stake in what happens to them. When the story has given you a reason to care whether they succeed or fail, Not because you want them to win, necessarily, but because their success or failure means something beyond the mechanics of the plot. Investment in outcome comes from one of several sources. It can come from relationship proximity. If a villain is deeply connected to a character you already care about, connected in a way that their actions have direct, irreversible consequences for that character, then your emotional investment in the characters you love transfers, partially, to the villain. You care about the villain because caring about the people they affect is already part of your experience of the story. It can come from philosophical clarity. If a villain articulates a worldview that is genuinely coherent, if their logic is internally consistent and their values are clearly defined, then engaging with that worldview becomes interesting in a way that goes beyond the plot. You find yourself arguing with them, testing their logic, applying their reasoning to situations outside the story, and finding that it generates uncomfortable but coherent conclusions. And it can come from personal recognition. The deepest form of villain investment happens when you recognize something about yourself in them. Not the evil parts, not the violence or the cruelty, but the underlying wound or desire that their evil grew from. When a villain's core motivation connects to something true about human experience, you feel their presence in a way that goes far beneath the level of story. Rick and Morty, at its best, uses all three of these mechanisms simultaneously. And the villains it created using all three at once are the ones that audiences are still thinking about years after the episodes aired. There's a philosophical dimension to this that's worth exploring before we go any further. Stories have always been the primary technology humans use to understand other minds. Before psychology as a formal discipline existed, before neuroscience had any tools worth using, before any of the frameworks we now use to systematically analyze human behavior, there were stories. And stories worked because they gave you access to another perspective in a way that was safe enough to actually experience. You could understand a murderer's reasoning from the inside without being in danger. You could feel the pull of a seductive philosophy without being consumed by it. You could explore what it's like to want something badly enough to do terrible things to get it, and then come back out of that exploration intact, with something you'd learned. That's what villains are for, in the deepest sense. Not obstacles, not antagonists, not plot devices. They're invitations to understand something about human experience that you couldn't access safely any other way. Great villains work because they're taking you somewhere real. They're showing you something true about what people are capable of, what ideas lead to when they're followed all the way out, what happens to a person when specific kinds of damage accumulate in specific configurations. And that truth is what stays with you. Not the fight, not the villain's power level, not the dramatic moment of defeat. The truth is what stays. Rick and Morty is a show that's been unusually willing to follow its ideas all the way out, to take a premise seriously and see what it actually implies. To let a character's logic run to its conclusion rather than pulling back at the last moment to reassure the audience that things are actually fine. That willingness is why its villains land as hard as they do. They're not metaphors, they're conclusions. They're what happens when you take a set of beliefs, or wounds, or philosophies, and let them run without interruption for a very long time. Let's think for a moment about what memorable actually means when we apply it to fictional villains. Memory is selective. Your brain doesn't store everything that happens to you. It stores what mattered, what carried emotional weight, what connected to something it already knew was important. The rest gets compressed or discarded. When a villain is memorable years after you watch them, what that means neurologically is that your brain tagged their existence as significant. It filed them alongside the things you'd decided were worth keeping, not because the story told you to remember them, but because something about the experience of encountering them triggered the same processes your brain uses to encode things that matter in real life. That's a remarkable thing to achieve in fiction. It means the villain crossed a threshold from character in a story to something I actually processed emotionally at a real depth. What crosses that threshold? Not power, as we've established. Not even sympathetic backstory, which is useful but not sufficient. Not screen time. Some of the most memorable villains appear remarkably rarely. What crosses the threshold is personal meaning. When a villain means something to you specifically, when their existence illuminates something about your own life, your own fears, your own understanding of how the world works, then your brain takes them seriously. It treats them as real information, and real information gets stored. This is why the most memorable villains often feel slightly different to different people, because they're connecting to different real things depending on who you are. The same villain who represents one person's fear of meaninglessness represents another person's recognition of a parent and another person's confrontation with their own nihilism. The villain is the same. What they mean is personal. Rick and Morty has been remarkably deliberate about building villains who carry this kind of multivalent personal meaning. Their antagonists are specific enough to be coherent, but built around themes universal enough that they connect differently to different people. That's genuinely hard to do. Most stories err too far in one direction or the other, too specific to resonate broadly, or too general to feel real. There's one more foundational concept worth laying down before we can really talk about the specific antagonists Rick and Morty gave us. The concept is this: a villain is most powerful when they're the hero of their own story. This sounds like a cliche now because it's been said so many times, but the reason it keeps being said is because it keeps being true, and it keeps being ignored anyway. The hero of their own story doesn't mean the villain thinks they're heroic. It doesn't mean they have a justification they tell themselves. It means something more specific than that. It means they have a goal they're pursuing for reasons that, from inside their own perspective, are coherent and even rational. It means that if you could somehow inhabit their worldview, not agree with it, just genuinely occupy it, then their actions would make sense. Not in a way you'd endorse, but in a way you could follow. When a villain achieves this quality, something interesting happens narratively. They stop being an obstacle and start being an argument. They're not just getting in the hero's way, they're proposing something. A different set of values, a different answer to some fundamental question about how to exist, a different conclusion drawn from premises that, if you're honest, aren't entirely wrong. And an argument requires engagement. You can walk around an obstacle. You cannot walk around an argument without at least noticing that it's there. Rick and Morty's greatest villains are arguments. Each of them proposes something about the world, about freedom, about power, about the meaning of individual existence in an infinite multiverse, that the show takes seriously enough to let stand. They don't get defeated because they were wrong. They get defeated when they do get defeated for other reasons, and their arguments persist even after they're gone. That's why we still think about them. Let's be specific for a moment about what distinguishes Rick and Morty's approach to antagonism from what most animated series do. Most animated antagonists are defined by what they want to do: conquer the world, destroy the hero, accumulate power, achieve revenge. The want is their whole characterization. They're a motive in a body. Rick and Morty's best villains are defined by what they believe. Their actions follow from their beliefs in ways that feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. And because their beliefs are clearly articulated, sometimes in dialogue, sometimes in action, sometimes in the specific choices they make in specific moments, the audience understands them not as people who want things, but as people who see the world a particular way. That's a much more interesting kind of villain to spend time with, because you can disagree with someone's beliefs in a way that you can't disagree with someone's desires. Wanting power is just a trait. Believing that the only honest response to an infinite, indifferent universe is to claim absolute individual freedom, that's a philosophy. And philosophy invites argument. The argument doesn't have to happen on screen. It can happen in your head, weeks after you watch the episode. That's the sign that the villain was truly well built. They're still talking to you, still making their case, still demanding a response. There's a specific quality that Rick and Morty's writers seem to understand about memorable antagonists that a lot of storytellers miss. The quality is patience. Not patience in the villain's characterization necessarily, though that's there too. Patience in the storytelling. The willingness to let a villain's true nature, or true power, or true philosophy reveal itself slowly. Across many episodes, across seasons, most storytelling is impatient with its villains. It introduces them and then immediately demonstrates what they're capable of. Big entrance, big statement, big demonstration of power, or intelligence, or cruelty. And then the audience knows what the villain is, and the rest of the story is about watching the hero deal with someone the audience has already fully assessed. There's nothing wrong with that structure. It works, but it doesn't create the particular kind of haunting that comes from a villain you never quite fully understand. From a villain whose depths you keep discovering. From a villain who, even after they're gone, you're still not entirely sure you saw clearly. The best Rick and Morty antagonists are built with this kind of patience. Their introductions are understated. Their capabilities are suggested before they're demonstrated. Their philosophies emerge gradually, in fragments, across time. And by the time you understand them fully, they've been living in the back of your mind for so long that they feel like something you've actually known rather than something you've just watched. That distinction between knowing and watching is everything. Watching is passive, knowing is personal, and the villains you know are the ones you can't let go of. Before this documentary goes anywhere near specific episodes or specific antagonists, there's one last thing to say about the nature of great villainy, because it's the thing that ties everything else together. A great villain changes the hero. Not defeats the hero, not threatens the hero, not challenges the hero in some dramatic way that the hero then overcomes and moves on from unchanged. Changes the hero, permanently, in ways that were not reversible, that the story didn't fix or compensate for. Changes in the kind that leave a mark that's still visible seasons later. This is the deepest thing a villain can do in a story, because it confirms something that most fiction is reluctant to confirm, that real encounters leave real traces, that something can happen to a person that alters who they are in ways they can never fully recover from. That loss is real and irreversible, not just temporarily inconvenient before the protagonist bounces back. When a villain changes the hero permanently, the villain achieves a kind of narrative immortality. Every scene after the villain's disappearance carries their influence. Every decision the hero makes is filtered through what the villain did to them. The villain is gone, but they're not absent. They're built into the hero now. The story carries them forward even when they're not on screen. This is what Rick and Morty has done with its greatest antagonists. And it's the reason that even viewers who haven't rewatched the show in years can still feel the weight of certain scenes. Because the heroes carry them forward. Because Rick Sanchez, in the seasons after certain encounters, is a different person than he was before. And that difference is a ghost. A permanent reminder of what the villain took. We'll spend a lot of time in this documentary talking about specific villains, specific scenes, specific moments of writing that exemplify everything we've been exploring here. But before any of that, it felt important to do this, to sit with the question itself for a while, to understand what we're actually asking when we ask why certain antagonists stay with us. Because the answer has almost nothing to do with what most people assume it does. It's not power, it's not backstory, it's not screen time, it's not even cleverness, though cleverness helps. It's meaning, coherence. The feeling that this villain exists for real reasons, in a real interior world, with real beliefs that they're following to their real conclusions, regardless of whether you or anyone else endorses those conclusions. It's the sense that if you could follow them home, you'd find someone living a complete life according to a complete logic. A life that has nothing to do with the hero except in the specific ways the story put them in the same room. That's the villain who stays with you. That's the villain you're still arguing with at midnight. That's the villain who, for just a moment in just the right episode, made you wonder whether they were entirely wrong. Rick and Morty built several of them, and the chapters that follow are about understanding exactly how. Chapter 2. Evil Morty, the Patient Mastermind. There's an episode of Rick and Morty that most people remember for its twist. The reveal comes at the end. A Morty, indistinguishable from every other Morty you've watched across the series, soft-spoken and nervous and visually identical to the character you've come to know, is unmasked as the architect of something genuinely horrifying, a scheme that involved the systematic abuse and mind control of other Ricks. A plan so coldly constructed, so patiently executed, that by the time the audience understood what had happened, it had already been over for a while. The eye patch comes off. The yellow eye underneath looks at the camera for just a moment, and then he's gone. That's it. That's the entire Evil Morty introduction, in terms of screen time dedicated to him as himself. A few seconds, a yellow eye, a small controlled smile that tells you almost nothing about what's behind it, except that there's something there. Something substantial, something that's been planning for a very long time. Most shows would have followed that moment immediately. Cut to a new episode featuring Evil Morty as the central villain. Explored his backstory, gave him speeches, let him demonstrate his intelligence through elaborate schemes that the audience could watch unfold in real time. Given him presence and weight through the conventional means of presence and weight, screen time, dialogue, explanation. Rick and Morty didn't do any of that. Evil Morty disappeared, and the show let the silence do the work. To understand why that choice was so significant, you have to understand what the silence actually did to the audience. When a character appears, does something remarkable, and then vanishes before you can fully process them, before you can categorize them, before you can file them away under a familiar type, before you can decide exactly what kind of threat they represent. Your brain doesn't close the file. It can't. There isn't enough information to close it. So it stays open, and an open file is an active file. Your brain keeps returning to it, looking for new information, trying to assemble what it has into a complete picture. Every subsequent episode of Rick and Morty became, for the audience members who remembered that yellow eye, a potential source of new information. A possible clue. A moment that might, if examined correctly, reveal something about what Evil Morty is, and what he wants, and where he went. Most of those moments had nothing to do with Evil Morty at all. But the open file meant the audience was looking anyway. And looking, in storytelling, is everything. The show had created genuine curiosity without spending any significant narrative resources to do it. One scene, a few seconds, a yellow eye, and suddenly a portion of the Rick and Morty audience was invested in a character they knew almost nothing about. That's efficient. That's elegant. And it's one of the most underused techniques in long-form storytelling. The episode was close Rick counters of the Rick kind, and its surface concern is the politics of the Citadel of Ricks, the interdimensional society formed by Rick variants from across the multiverse. Rick C-137 is framed for the murder of several Ricks and forced to go on the run with Morty. The investigation leads to a Morty who has been weaponized, his brainwaves used to mask the Rick who built him, exploiting the fact that the Citadel doesn't monitor Morty brainwaves because they assume Morty is background noise. It's a clever premise, but what it reveals, in retrospect, is that Evil Morty understood the Citadel's assumptions about Morty better than the Citadel understood itself. He knew that Mortys were invisible, he knew that no one was watching, and he built his entire strategy around that blind spot. This is worth sitting with, because it tells you something essential about Evil Morty that the show never had to state explicitly. He is a Morty who sees clearly, who looked at the system he was born into, understood its structure at a level of precision that the system's own architects didn't achieve, and then made a decision about what to do with that understanding. He didn't rage against the system, he didn't announce his grievances, he didn't seek validation or allies or any of the things that most fictional revolutionaries seek in their first act. He simply began working, quietly, patiently, invisibly, using the exact blind spot that the system had never bothered to close because it had never occurred to anyone that a Morty might be the one to notice it. That's the introduction. That's everything you get the first time. And it's enough, if you're paying attention, to tell you that what you're dealing with here is something genuinely new in the show's universe. The second Evil Morty appearance came in Tales from the Citadel, the Season 3 episode that explores life inside the Citadel of Ricks in detail for the first time, following several characters through their days in the bureaucratic, stratified society that Ricks have built for themselves. Evil Morty is there, running for president of the Citadel under his actual name, not as a scheme, not hidden behind puppets or intermediaries, but openly, brazenly. A Morty, running to lead a society that has always treated Mortys as sidekicks. And he wins. What's remarkable about this appearance isn't the victory, it's how he achieves it. He runs an authentic populist campaign that speaks directly to the resentments of working-class Ricks and Mortys who have been failed by the Citadel's ruling class. His speeches are real. His critique of the Citadel's corruption is accurate. He's not manufacturing outrage, he's pointing at actual injustice and saying, clearly and correctly, that it exists and that those in power have never intended to fix it. The audience watches this and feels something complicated. Because he's right. Everything he's saying about the Citadel is true. The working Ricks are exploited. The Mortys are treated as disposable. The system is corrupt in exactly the ways he describes. And yet, you've seen the yellow eye. You know what he's capable of. You know that this clarity about injustice isn't necessarily compassion for the people suffering from it. You suspect, correctly, as it turns out, that he's using the truth as a tool, that the accuracy of his diagnosis has nothing to do with whether he intends to be the cure. That's the complicated feeling Evil Morty consistently generates. He's always right about the thing he says he's right about. His analysis is always accurate. His observations about power, about exploitation, about the way systems treat people as means rather than ends, these are correct. They're genuinely correct. And his correctness makes it impossible to simply dismiss him, even when you suspect his ultimate intentions are nothing like what he's presenting. A villain who is always right about their diagnosis of the problem, but whose solution you can't trust. That's a genuinely sophisticated creation. Because they force you to engage with the diagnosis anyway. You can't write off the analysis just because you distrust the analyst. By the time Rick Morty Jack and Rick Ternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort arrived in Season 5, Evil Morty had become something even more unusual. A villain whose plan, when it was finally revealed, was not what anyone expected. He wasn't trying to conquer the Citadel. He wasn't trying to punish Ricks. He wasn't building an empire or accumulating power for its own sake. He was trying to leave. The central finite curve, the reveal that the accessible multiverse had been artificially limited to only those universes where Rick Sanchez was the smartest person alive, was the axis around which his entire project turned. Every scheme, every election, every careful positioning had been oriented toward one goal: breaking out of a reality that had been constructed to center Rick. Think about that for a moment. Evil Morty is a character who was born in a universe specifically selected because it revolved around a version of the most powerful person in the constructed multiverse. He grew up in a world built to serve Rick's centrality. He existed in a system that treated Morty, every Morty, as a support function for Rick's adventures, Rick's safety, Rick's story. And he decided, no, not "I want to destroy Rick," not "I want revenge for what Rick did to me." Those would have been simpler motivations, and the show could have built them easily. It had the pieces. Evil Morty's origin, whatever it was, almost certainly involved suffering under a Rick. The raw material for a revenge narrative was absolutely there. But revenge wasn't what he built. What he built was an exit. That single conceptual choice, making Evil Morty's goal liberation rather than revenge or conquest, is what elevates him from a sophisticated antagonist to something genuinely remarkable in the history of animated villainy. Because it reframes everything. Every terrible thing he did along the way looks different when you understand that he was doing it in service of getting out. Not in service of winning within the system. In service of removing himself from the system entirely. The scene where Evil Morty destroys the central finite curve and passes through to the unconstrained multiverse is one of the strangest endings a villain has ever received. He wins. Completely. He achieves exactly what he was working toward. The machine is destroyed. The barrier falls. The unconstrained multiverse. Infinite realities where Rick isn't necessarily the smartest, where reality wasn't filtered to serve one person's centrality, opens up, and Evil Morty steps through it. And then he's gone. The audience is left to process this without any narrative reassurance. There's no immediate consequence. There's no obvious cost. There's no moment where Rick or Morty articulate what this means or how they feel about it. The scene simply ends, and the character is simply gone. And whatever happens in the infinite universes beyond the finite curve happens without a camera to follow it. What do you do with that as a viewer? Most villain endings give you closure. The villain is defeated, or redeemed, or killed, or imprisoned. And the story moves on. The threat is resolved. You know what happened. Evil Morty's ending gives you none of that. He succeeded, he escaped. He's somewhere in an infinite, unknowable multiverse right now. In some sense, doing what you don't know. Whether what he found beyond the curve was what he wanted, you don't know. Whether he's at peace, or still angry, or building something new, or simply existing somewhere finally free of the weight he was carrying, you don't know. That uncertainty is intentional. And it's doing something very specific. It's making him persist. Because an unresolved question stays open. And an open question keeps returning. You think about Evil Morty not just because he was interesting while he was present, but because you still don't know how his story ends. You're still holding his file open, still waiting for information that may never come. That's an extraordinary thing to engineer in an audience. It's the storytelling equivalent of a conversation that ended before you finished saying what you wanted to say. Your brain keeps rehearsing the remainder, keeps imagining how it might have gone, keeps the person present in your mental landscape far longer than a completed conversation would. Let's talk about the mystery itself as a structural choice, because it's central to why Evil Morty works as well as he does. The show never gives you Evil Morty's backstory. You get implications. You get visual evidence in Rick and Morty Jack that suggests he went through experiences with his Rick that were genuinely traumatic, a montage of moments between a Rick and Morty that grows progressively darker. But you don't get a scene where Evil Morty explains what happened to him. You don't get a speech where he describes his pain and the audience understands how the wound became the weapon. That absence is not an oversight. It's a craft decision. Because backstory explanation does something subtle and slightly damaging to a villain's power. Once you know exactly how a villain became what they are, once the wound is fully described, the process fully mapped, there's a part of your brain that quietly files it away. Understood. Categorized. It makes the villain more sympathetic, sometimes, but also more familiar, more manageable, less frightening. Partial backstory does the opposite. Implications without explanation leave the specific shape of the damage undefined, and your imagination will fill the undefined space with whatever it finds most resonant. Which means Evil Morty's backstory is, for every viewer who's thought about it, a backstory that connects to their own intuitions about what kind of damage could produce that kind of coldness. Their own understanding of what it takes for someone to decide that the only acceptable solution is to burn the whole system down. That personalization is more powerful than any specific backstory the writers could have given him. Because it's yours. You constructed it, and that means you're invested in it in a way you couldn't be if the show had simply told you what to think. There's a specific quality to Evil Morty's intelligence that deserves its own moment, because it's different from the kind of intelligence the show usually celebrates. Rick is brilliant in a way that's fundamentally experiential. He understands how things work because he's worked with them, tested them, broken them apart, and reassembled them across 100 universes and a lifetime of experiments. His intelligence is accumulated knowledge in motion, fast, intuitive, improvisational. Evil Morty is intelligent in a different way. His intelligence is structural. He sees systems. He sees how the pieces of a complex arrangement fit together, where the load-bearing points are, where the blind spots exist, how to apply pressure at exactly the right place to get the outcome you want, without anyone noticing what you're doing until it's already done. These are genuinely different kinds of intelligence. And putting them in opposition creates something more interesting than simply having two smart characters in the same story. Rick's intelligence is optimized for engagement with the world, for navigating complexity in real time. Evil Morty's intelligence is optimized for a particular goal, for understanding systems well enough to dismantle them from the inside. In a contest of pure power, Rick would probably win. He has more tools, more experience, more raw capability. But Evil Morty isn't playing a game of pure power. He's playing a game of systems. And in a systems game, the player who best understands the structure of the game has an enormous advantage over the player who's simply the most capable individual within it. That's another thing Evil Morty gets right, that most fictional antagonists don't. He doesn't try to beat Rick on Rick's terms. He plays a different game entirely. One that Rick, for all his intelligence, is not particularly well designed to win. It's worth asking, carefully, whether Evil Morty is a villain at all, in the conventional sense. He does terrible things. The torture and mind control infrastructure he built to hide behind is unambiguously atrocious. The casualties he accumulates in service of his goals are real. The methods he uses, manipulation, exploitation, the willingness to treat people as means, are genuinely wrong in ways the show doesn't ask you to forgive. But his goal. Is freedom a villainous goal? Is the desire to exist outside a system that was built to make you invisible and subordinate something the audience is supposed to condemn? The show is smart enough not to answer this directly. It presents what Evil Morty does and lets you work out what you think about why. It doesn't ask you to endorse his methods, but it also doesn't ask you to dismiss his reasons. It holds both, the horror of the means and the clarity of the underlying desire, simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them. That unresolved tension is again what makes him persist. A villain whose wrong is simple stays where you leave them. A villain whose wrong is complex, whose methods are indefensible, but whose fundamental desire you might, in some private part of yourself, understand. That villain follows you. You keep thinking about whether it was possible for someone in his position to want what he wanted without becoming what he became. Whether there was a path to the same destination that didn't require those methods. Whether the system he was trying to escape was itself so total, so encompassing, that there was no clean way out. And whether, if there isn't a clean way out, that changes how you evaluate the methods used to find any way out at all. These are not comfortable questions. And the fact that a cartoon character is making you ask them is a sign that something genuinely impressive happened in the writing room. The relationship between Evil Morty and Rick C-137, our Rick, the Rick, is one of the most interesting unexplored relationships in the show's history, precisely because it's never been directly addressed. Our Rick and our Morty aren't the Rick and Morty that Evil Morty came from. Whatever happened to him happened with a different Rick. But Rick C-137 represents something for Evil Morty that goes beyond personal history. He represents the type, the archetype, the specific configuration of intelligence, ego, and barely disguised emotional damage that created the system Evil Morty spent his life trying to escape. When Evil Morty looks at Rick C-137, he's not looking at the specific person who wronged him. He's looking at the structure that produced his pain, instantiated in its clearest possible form. And our Rick, who is, by the show's own internal accounting, exceptional even among Ricks, is the perfect object for that particular look. The show never plays out what might happen if they sat in a room together and actually talked. That conversation exists only in the imagination of the audience. But the imagination of the audience is exactly where Evil Morty has always been most powerful. What does Evil Morty ultimately mean as a storytelling achievement? He means that patience is a superpower in narrative construction, that the slowest building villains can become the most powerful, because the audience has been living with the mystery long enough that any revelation feels earned rather than delivered. He means that a villain's goal can be more interesting than their methods, that what someone is ultimately trying to achieve can carry more moral complexity than anything they do along the way, and that complexity is what makes them stick. He means that absence is a form of presence in storytelling, that a character you see rarely can occupy more space in an audience's imagination than a character who appears in every episode, precisely because the imagination is always more vivid than the depiction. And he means that freedom, the specific burning desire to simply be outside a system that was built to diminish you, is one of the most powerful motivations you can give a character, because it's real, because it resonates. Because whatever specific form the system takes in the story, the experience of wanting to be out of something that was built to contain you is not fictional, it's human. And that's the final thing worth saying about Evil Morty before we move on. His ultimate power as a character is that his desire is entirely recognizable. Strip away the multiverse, strip away the Citadel, strip away all the elaborate science fiction architecture, and you have someone who was born into a world built to make them small, who looked at that world clearly, who decided they wanted something different, and who spent a very long time working quietly toward the exit. That's a story as old as the impulse to leave. And that's why, long after the yellow eye and the broken curve and the portal closing behind him, Evil Morty is still here, still in the conversation, still in the imagination, still asking, from whatever unconstrained universe he found on the other side, whether you would have done anything differently. Chapter 3. Rick Prime, the perfect personal enemy. There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name in English. It's the pain of knowing that someone who hurt you didn't hurt you because they hated you, didn't hurt you out of anger or jealousy or any emotion that would give the hurt a comprehensible shape. They hurt you because you simply weren't interesting enough to consider, because the calculation they were running when they made the decision that destroyed part of your life didn't include you as a meaningful variable. You were in the way, or you were convenient, or you were simply there, and that was enough, and that was all. Hatred you can work with. Hatred means you mattered enough to generate a strong feeling. Jealousy means you had something worth wanting. Even cruelty, at its most deliberate, implies a relationship, implies that the person causing the pain thought about you enough to direct something specific at you. But indifference. The particular flavor of indifference that comes from a person who is simply too absorbed in their own project to register that you're a person, that's harder to metabolize. That sits differently. That follows you in a way that conscious malice often doesn't. Because there's no logic to grab onto, no reason to decode, no moment of understanding that might eventually release you from it. Rick Prime is built entirely from that feeling, and that's why he's one of the most effective personal villains in the history of animated television. To understand Rick Prime, you have to understand what he is in relation to our Rick. Rick C-137, the Rick we've followed across the entire series, the Rick we know, lost his wife and daughter to an attack that was carried out, depending on how you understand the show's timeline, in a manner connected to a version of himself who made a different choice. The specifics of the Rick and Diane backstory are deliberately incomplete, as the show has been careful about exactly how much of Rick's past it makes explicit. But what is clear, across the arc that builds through seasons 5 and 6 in particular, is that Rick Prime is the Rick variant who, when a younger Rick C-137 rejected the weapon he was offering, responded by killing Rick C-137's family. Not in a fit of rage, not out of hatred for that specific Rick, but as a message, a demonstration, a way of resolving an argument by removing the person who was making it and doing so in a manner that would be instructive. It's a monstrous thing, and what makes it most monstrous is what Rick Prime felt while doing it, which was, almost certainly, very little. That's the key to Rick Prime as a character. He's not Rick's nemesis because he hates Rick. He's Rick's nemesis because he once made a decision about Rick's life with the same casual disregard you might apply to changing a travel route because traffic looked inconvenient. Rick was an obstacle. Rick's family was the most efficient tool for removing the obstacle. The decision was made and executed, and then Rick Prime moved on, because there were other things to do, and this had been dealt with. And our Rick has been carrying that for decades. The shape of the wound matters enormously in understanding why Rick Prime works as a villain. Most fictional revenge narratives are built around hatred meeting hatred. The villain did something terrible because they hated the hero, or wanted something the hero had, or were trying to destroy something the hero loved. And the hero responds with hatred of their own, justified, earned, dramatically satisfying. Two strong forces in direct opposition. Rick's relationship with Rick Prime doesn't work that way, because the force was never symmetrical. Rick Prime didn't hate Rick. Rick Prime, as far as the available evidence suggests, barely registered Rick as someone worth sustained attention. He was a problem that needed solving, and then he wasn't even that. He was solved and forgotten, and Rick Prime moved on. But Rick couldn't move on. Because the thing Rick Prime did so casually, with such minimal emotional investment, destroyed the life Rick was building. Killed the people Rick loved. Set Rick on the path. Through grief, through rage, through the decades of drinking and dimension hopping and performative nihilism that produced the character we've been watching. Everything about Rick C-137 that we've understood as character, the alcoholism, the emotional unavailability, the genius channeled into chaos instead of anything constructive, the relationship with his daughter Beth that is always slightly off because of what she represents and what he lost. All of it traces back, ultimately, to something Rick Prime did without caring very much about the consequences. That's a devastating asymmetry, and the show is fully aware of it, and builds its emotional architecture around it deliberately. When Rick Prime is introduced as a full antagonist, when the show finally commits to exploring him rather than leaving him at the periphery of Rick's backstory, one of the most important choices the writers make is keeping him genuinely, clearly intelligent. This matters because the temptation in personal revenge narratives is to eventually reveal that the person who caused so much damage was somehow lesser than the hero all along. That the monster, examined up close, was smaller than the fear of them. This narrative move exists to reassure the audience, and the hero, that the suffering was disproportionate to the cause. That the person who created all that damage wasn't actually worthy of the space they occupied in the hero's mind. Rick Prime doesn't allow that reassurance. He's as smart as Rick, maybe, in certain configurations, in certain contexts, smarter. He made the same choices Rick made at key moments in their shared history, but without the emotional complications that shaped Rick C-137's path. He went further, did more, became something more purely optimized because he wasn't being slowed down by grief or guilt or love or any of the feelings that, for Rick C-137, were always the sand in the gears of his own worst impulses. He's what Rick might have been if Rick hadn't lost anyone. If the wound that humanized Rick, that kept him, despite everything, connected to something that mattered, had never been inflicted, which creates a deeply uncomfortable relationship between Rick's tragedy and Rick's character. Because if the pain is what kept Rick connected to humanity, if the grief is part of what makes our Rick someone we can love, rather than something we simply fear, then Rick Prime's decision to inflict that pain was, in a horrible accidental way, the thing that preserved Rick's humanity. Rick Prime made Rick C-137 suffer. And the suffering made Rick C-137 capable of love. Neither Rick would find any comfort in that. There's a scene, or rather a category of scenes, that accumulates across the seasons in which Rick is searching for Rick Prime, and it's worth thinking about what those scenes are actually about. On the surface, they're about revenge. Rick wants to find the person who killed his family and make them pay. That's the plot-level reading, and it's not wrong. But underneath the revenge narrative is something more psychologically complex. Rick is looking for something that most people who've experienced profound, formative loss spend their lives looking for: an explanation that makes sense. A moment where the person who caused the damage is present and accountable and looking back at you, and you can finally have the conversation that's been running in your head for decades. The problem is that Rick Prime will never give Rick that conversation. Not because he can't, he's intelligent enough to engage with it, but because the premise of the conversation requires Rick Prime to accept that what he did was significant, that it mattered, that the calculus he ran was wrong, or at minimum, that the outcome deserves to be faced. And Rick Prime doesn't believe that. He made a decision and moved on. The idea that he should now stand in one place and receive Rick's feelings about that decision, as though his decision was some load-bearing event in a story that Rick Prime was participating in, that's not a frame Rick Prime recognizes. He doesn't think he's the villain of Rick's story. He barely thinks he's a character in Rick's story. He has his own story, and Rick C-137 is a footnote in it. That impossibility, the impossibility of forcing a reckoning with someone who doesn't recognize the thing they did as requiring a reckoning, is one of the most honest things the show has ever depicted about the experience of trying to process certain kinds of loss. Rick Prime's philosophy, such as it is, deserves careful examination, because like Evil Morty, he's not simply evil, he's coherent. His worldview has internal logic. What Rick Prime appears to believe, based on his behavior across the show's run, is something like radical solipsistic consequentialism. The universe is infinite. Lives are infinitely replaceable. Anything that happens to any individual, in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, is ultimately without unique significance. The only meaningful unit of value is the project, the specific intellectual or experiential pursuit that the individual is engaged in. In that framework, other people have value insofar as they contribute to or are necessary for your project. They don't have intrinsic value as conscious beings with their own interior lives that matter independently of you. They're resources. Better ones, worse ones, temporarily useful ones, ones that need to be removed when they become obstacles. That worldview isn't entirely alien. Parts of it echo things that Rick C-137 has said, in his darker moments, across the series. The nihilism is recognizable. The intellectual framework for dismissing the significance of individual lives, in a multiverse where copies of every person exist across infinite variants, is available to any character in the show who wants to use it. The difference is that Rick C-137 doesn't actually live by that philosophy, even when he claims to. He loves people. He'd never admit it in those terms, but the evidence is everywhere. In the lengths he goes to for his family, in the moments where his nihilism cracks and something genuine and vulnerable surfaces underneath. Rick C-137 uses nihilism as armor. He doesn't believe it the way someone who truly believed it would behave. Rick Prime actually believes it, or has so thoroughly arranged his psychology around it that the distinction between believing it and performing it has collapsed. And that's the real horror of him. Not that he's powerful, not that he's intelligent, not even that he killed Rick's family. It's that he shows Rick what Rick could have become if Rick had ever actually committed to his own stated philosophy. Rick Prime is Rick's ideology given perfect expression, and the ideology, given perfect expression, produces a monster. Personal enemies in fiction are different from grand antagonists in ways that are worth thinking about explicitly. A grand antagonist threatens the world, or the universe, or some abstract value like freedom or life itself. The stakes are enormous. The conflict is epic. Everything is at risk. A personal enemy threatens something smaller and harder to quantify: your sense of the story of your own life. Your ability to believe that what happened to you was comprehensible, that the people who shaped your experience were real and present and engaged with you as a person, that your losses were meaningful rather than incidental. Grand antagonists create tension. Personal enemies create grief, and grief is stickier than tension. Grief doesn't resolve when the threat is neutralized. Grief continues after the battle, after the victory, after the credits. Grief is the mark that a personal enemy leaves that doesn't heal just because the conflict is resolved. Rick and Morty understood this distinction and built Rick Prime accordingly. He's not a threat to the universe, or at least, that's not primarily what he is. He's the specific person who took something from Rick that Rick can never fully recover. He's the author of the grief that shaped everything else. The show could have given Rick a grand antagonist as his ultimate nemesis, It could have pitted him against some universal threat that required all of Rick's genius to defeat. That would have been dramatically satisfying in a clean, conventional way. Instead, it gave him this: a man who barely remembers doing what Rick can never forget. A man who moved on before Rick even finished falling apart. That's not satisfying. That's true. There's a specific narrative problem that Rick Prime creates by being what he is, and the way the show handles that problem reveals something important about its maturity as a piece of storytelling. The problem is this: if Rick catches Rick Prime and kills him, does that fix anything? In most revenge narratives, the answer the story provides, even if it's complicated, is something like yes. The act of confrontation and resolution provides closure. The hero comes out the other side changed, and while the change isn't simple happiness, there's a sense that the wound has been addressed. The story has found an ending for the grief. But Rick and Morty seems genuinely uncertain whether killing Rick Prime would give Rick what he's been looking for. Not because Rick Prime doesn't deserve consequences, the show isn't making a claim about the ethics of revenge, but because the thing Rick is actually missing can't be retrieved through any action against Rick Prime. Rick wants his family back. He wants the life he was building before the attack. He wants the version of himself that existed before that wound, the Rick who was capable of that kind of ordinary happiness without understanding yet what it would cost. None of those things can be given to him by Rick Prime's death. They're gone. The multiverse isn't going to retroactively restore them. Rick C-137 will still be who he became, still carry what he carries, still be fundamentally shaped by a loss that 100 different victories can't undo. The confrontation Rick is seeking is the confrontation with something that can't be confronted, the irreversibility of the past. Rick Prime is a stand-in for that irreversibility. He's the face you can put on something that doesn't have a face. The person you can chase when what you're really chasing is the version of your life that got taken away. Chasing him gives the grief somewhere to go, but catching him won't dissolve the grief. The show knows this, and it treats the knowledge with enough respect to let it complicate the narrative rather than resolving it neatly. Let's think about what Rick Prime does to the audience's relationship with Rick C-137, because this is part of how the villain's function extends beyond his own character. Before we understand Rick Prime, before we have a clear picture of what happened to Rick, what was taken, what the grief is actually about, Rick is an enigma. He's compelling and funny, and sometimes frightening, but the emotional core of him is opaque in a way that keeps you at a slight distance. You enjoy him, you might even love him, but you don't entirely understand what's underneath. Rick Prime fills in the shape of the wound. He tells you not what Rick is, but why Rick is the way he is. And once you have that, once you can see the specific damage and where it came from and what it cost, your relationship with every previous moment of Rick's character retrospectively deepens. The scene where Rick is drinking alone in his garage gets heavier. The moments where Rick pushes people away, where he performs not caring and sometimes performs it so hard you can see the effort. Those moments carry more now. The entire texture of Rick's relationship with Beth, with the family he found his way back to after losing the one he built, reads differently. Rick Prime doesn't just create a villain for Rick to chase. He creates a context in which Rick C-137 becomes more fully legible as a person. He's the key that unlocks the emotional subtext that was always there but never quite fully accessible. That's the highest function a personal villain can serve. Not just threatening the hero, but illuminating them. The question of similarity between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime is one the show returns to with some regularity. And it's worth sitting with because it's genuinely uncomfortable. They're the same person. Not metaphorically. Literally. The same genetic template. The same foundational intelligence. The same early life, more or less, up to the point where their paths diverged. Everything that makes Rick Prime what he is was available to Rick C-137, and vice versa. What separated them wasn't intelligence, wasn't capability. It was, ultimately, the specific sequence of experiences that befell each of them, and the choices each made in response to those experiences. Rick C-137 chose, at some point, to care about people. Maybe not consciously, maybe not articulately, but the evidence of his life shows that he made that choice, and kept making it, even when it cost him. Rick Prime chose not to, or never made the choice at all. Simply ran his calculations without the variable of other people's intrinsic worth included in them, because something in his path never installed that variable. The similarity between them is what makes the difference between them so charged, because it suggests that the gap between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime isn't enormous. It's a specific wound, metabolized a specific way, a specific love, maintained at a specific cost. The difference is real and it matters, enormously, morally, but it's narrow enough to be frightening. If you look at Rick C-137 and Rick Prime as two possible outcomes of the same starting conditions, what you're looking at is something the show has always been interested in: the question of what makes a person who they are, and how much of who you are was ever fully in your control. Rick Prime also functions as an answer to a question that Rick and Morty has been asking since the first episode. What is Rick's intelligence for? Rick is the smartest person in the universe. Across the entire span of existence, there is no one who understands the mechanics of reality with greater precision or depth. That intelligence is, at various points in the show, presented as a gift, a burden, a weapon, a defense mechanism, a source of loneliness, and a form of self-destruction. But for all its complexity in Rick C-137, his intelligence is ultimately in service of something: family, connection, the relationships that he claims not to care about and then demonstrates, through his actions, that he cares about deeply. Rick Prime's intelligence serves nothing like that. It serves the project, whatever the current intellectual pursuit is. It serves itself, its pure capability without orientation toward anything beyond its own exercise. In that comparison, the show is making an argument: intelligence without love is just power, and power without love is exactly as cold and exactly as empty as it sounds. Rick Prime is what intelligence becomes when it optimizes itself completely, removes the friction of caring about people, and runs without restraint. He's the logical conclusion of a certain fantasy about what it would mean to be the smartest person in the universe without the inconvenience of emotional attachment. He's not appealing when you see him fully. He's a warning. And warnings, delivered this precisely, don't disappear when the story ends. What ultimately makes Rick Prime unforgettable, though, isn't any single element of his construction. It's the combination of personal stakes and philosophical weight and the specific kind of grief he represents. He's unforgettable because he's the reason. He's the answer to the question that every viewer who's spent significant time with Rick C-137 has been asking, consciously or not: what happened to him? What made him this? And the answer is a person who didn't care enough to think twice. That's all. That's the whole of it. Not a grand scheme, not a cosmic evil, not an ideology that required centuries of development. A person who made a calculation, removed an obstacle in the most complete way available, and moved on with their day. The simplicity of it is part of what makes it hurt. There's no satisfying complexity to the initial act. There's no moment where you understand Rick Prime and see that the reasons were enormous, and the choice was agonizing, and the consequences were unforeseeable. He did it because it was convenient. He moved on because it was over. He didn't think about Rick C-137 again, because Rick C-137 wasn't in his story anymore. But Rick C-137 has never stopped thinking about him. And neither, it turns out, have we. Chapter 4: Intelligence versus Ideology. There's a thought experiment worth trying before we go any further. Imagine the three of them in a room together. Rick C-137, Evil Morty, Rick Prime. Three of the most formidable minds the show has produced, sitting in the same space, aware of each other. What happens? The immediate assumption most people make is that the conflict would be about power. Who's strongest? Who has the most tools? Who would win if it came to a fight? That's the version of the thought experiment that plays out in most fictional universes. Put powerful characters together and see who dominates. But sit with it a little longer, and something more interesting emerges. The conflict wouldn't primarily be about power. It would be about worldview, about the specific, irreconcilable ways each of them understands what the universe is, what it demands of the people living in it, and what intelligence, genuine, extraordinary, reality-bending intelligence, is actually for. They'd be arguing, not fighting, arguing. And that argument, the one that never happens on screen because the show is too smart to make it explicit, is the argument that Rick and Morty has been having with itself across its entire run, about what it means to be the smartest person in the universe, about whether intelligence confers any particular kind of wisdom, about whether understanding how everything works gives you any advantage at all when it comes to understanding how to live. Rick C-137, Evil Morty, and Rick Prime are all extraordinarily intelligent. Their intelligence is roughly comparable at the highest level, even if it expresses differently in different contexts. None of them is limited by a failure to understand. None of them is operating with incomplete information about how the universe works. What separates them has nothing to do with how smart they are. It has everything to do with what they believe. Let's establish something clearly, because it's the foundation everything else in this chapter builds on. Intelligence is not a philosophy. It's a tool. This sounds obvious when it's stated directly. Of course, intelligence is a tool. It's a capacity, a form of processing, a way of engaging with information. It doesn't come with built-in values or pre-installed conclusions about how to live or what matters. But in fiction, and especially in science fiction, intelligence is routinely treated as though it were a philosophy, as though being smart enough automatically produces a particular kind of wisdom, as though sufficient analytical capacity will eventually generate correct conclusions about how to exist and what to value and what to do with your life. Rick and Morty has been interrogating that assumption from the beginning, and it does so most sharply through the contrast between its three most formidable characters. Because all three of them are using the same basic tool, extraordinary analytical intelligence, and arriving at completely different conclusions about the world. Not because one of them is using the tool correctly and the others are misapplying it, but because the tool, applied rigorously to the same available evidence, generates completely different outputs depending on what values and premises you run it on top of. Intelligence doesn't tell you what to care about. It just makes you very efficient at pursuing whatever you already care about. And what these three characters care about, at the deepest level, underneath all the behavior and strategy and surface-level motivation, is where the real difference lives. Rick C-137's intelligence is in permanent conflict with itself. That's one of the most important things to understand about him as a character, and it becomes clearest when you compare him to Rick Prime. Rick C-137 believes, at the explicit level, the level of what he says and how he presents himself to the world, in something close to nihilism. The universe is infinite and indifferent. Individual lives are cosmically insignificant. Meaning is a comforting fiction that intelligent people should be able to see past. Nothing matters. Drink more. But his behavior tells a completely different story. He goes to extraordinary lengths for his family. He makes sacrifices. Not the dramatic announced kind, but the quiet kind. The kind where you absorb a cost so that someone you love doesn't have to. He maintains relationships that are difficult and sometimes painful when the nihilistic position would be to simply walk away. He stays. And when he loses people, really loses them, he doesn't respond with the equanimity that genuine nihilism would require. He falls apart. The grief is real and total and doesn't fit inside the philosophical framework he claims to operate from. So what is Rick C-137 actually ideologically? What does he actually believe? Underneath the performance of not believing in anything, he believes in people. Specific people. The ones he's chosen, consciously or not, to attach himself to. His ideology isn't a grand philosophical system. It's something more modest and more human than that. It's the conviction that these particular connections matter, even in an infinite and indifferent universe, because to him, they do. Because the meaning that the universe doesn't provide automatically, he's manufactured through attachment. His nihilism is a shield. His love is the thing behind it. And the tension between those two things, the philosophy he performs and the values he actually lives, is the engine that drives most of the show's emotional depth. Evil Morty's ideology is more coherent than Rick's, and that coherence is part of what makes him formidable. Where Rick C-137 is internally divided, performing one set of beliefs while living by another, Evil Morty is remarkably unified. What he says and what he does align. His stated analysis of the Citadel's corruption is accurate, and his actions are genuinely aimed at the goal his analysis pointed to. He's not performing a philosophy he doesn't hold. He's living one he actually believes. What does Evil Morty actually believe? At its clearest, his ideology is about the primacy of autonomous existence, the right of any conscious being to determine the shape of its own life without having that life structured by systems built to serve someone else's interests. He grew up, in whatever universe he came from, in a world that was built for Rick. The central finite curve filtered the multiverse to produce a constructed reality centered on Rick's intelligence and Rick's significance. In that world, Morty's entire existence was instrumental. He was a tool, A sidekick. A brainwave pattern used to keep Rick safe because his specific frequency of anxiety was useful for hiding Rick's genius from Citadel detection. He didn't exist for himself. He existed for the system, and his ideology, the thing that drives everything he does, is the conviction that this is wrong. Not wrong in a personal, resentful way, though the personal dimension is clearly there. Wrong in a principled way. Wrong in the sense that any system that structures conscious beings as instruments for the benefit of other conscious beings is morally illegitimate, regardless of how powerful or well-established that system is. That's a real philosophical position. It has a coherent internal logic. It generates predictable conclusions when you apply it to specific situations. And it's genuinely hard to argue with in principle, even when you're horrified by the specific actions it justifies in practice. Evil Morty's intelligence, in this framework, is in service of his ideology. He's using his analytical capacity to achieve an ideological goal, freedom, in the most complete sense he can imagine, and every strategic decision he makes is filtered through that goal. His intelligence is oriented, directional, applied. Rick Prime's ideology is the cleanest of the three, and the most disturbing. He believes in nothing beyond the project. Not nihilism in the way Rick C-137 performs it. Rick Prime doesn't claim to believe in nothing as a posture or a defense. He simply operates from a framework in which the question of what to believe doesn't come up, because belief in values is itself a category he doesn't engage with. What he has instead of ideology is optimization. Whatever he's currently doing, he's doing it as efficiently as possible, and the question of whether it ought to be done, whether it's right, whether it serves anyone beyond himself, whether the cost to other people is justified, simply doesn't register as a relevant consideration. Other people, in Rick Prime's operational framework, are variables, inputs to calculations. They have no standing in his decision-making beyond their practical relevance to the project. When they're useful, they're used. When they're obstacles, they're removed. When they're irrelevant, they don't exist. This isn't cruelty. Cruelty would require Rick Prime to take satisfaction in causing pain, which would mean other people's experience mattered to him enough to generate satisfaction. Rick Prime doesn't take satisfaction in removing obstacles. He just removes them. The ideology, if you can call it that, is pure instrumentalism. Everything is a means. Nothing is an end except the next project. What makes this disturbing in a way that goes beyond simple villainy is that Rick Prime's framework is internally consistent. There's nothing logically wrong with it. If you start from the premise that conscious beings don't have intrinsic value, that the sense that other minds matter is a useful evolutionary heuristic rather than a genuine moral truth, then Rick Prime's behavior follows coherently. The horror is in the premise, not the logic. But the logic is impeccable. Now let's put the three ideologies in direct comparison, because the contrast reveals something that the show has been building toward across its entire run. Rick C-137 believes in practice in the value of specific human connections, even while performing a nihilism that denies this. His ideology is love, awkwardly held and poorly expressed and relentlessly undermined by his own behavior, but genuine. Evil Morty believes in the primacy of autonomous existence and the illegitimacy of systems that instrumentalize conscious beings. His ideology is freedom, pursued through methods that are themselves instrumentalizing, a tension the show is aware of and doesn't try to resolve. Rick Prime believes in nothing beyond the project. His ideology, if it deserves the name, is pure optimization without values. The most extreme version of the intellectual framework the show has been circling since episode 1. What's striking about this comparison is where the intelligence goes in each case. Rick C-137's intelligence is constantly in a kind of warfare with his values. He's smart enough to construct the nihilistic argument that nothing matters, but not willing enough to actually live by it. So his intelligence is partly used in service of his connections, keeping his family safe, solving the problems they face, and partly used in service of denying those connections, building elaborate philosophical scaffolding to pretend he doesn't care. His intelligence is divided, conflicted. The tool is working against itself. Evil Morty's intelligence is unified and directional. It goes fully into the project of achieving freedom, understanding systems, identifying leverage points, executing long-term plans with extraordinary patience. The tool is in complete service of a clear ideological goal. There's something almost admirable about the efficiency of it, even when the methods are appalling. Rick Prime's intelligence has no internal conflict at all. No divided loyalties, no values pulling against the optimization, no love creating friction in the calculations. The tool is running clean, unconstrained, maximum efficiency, and the result is the most capable individual and the most monstrous one. That's the argument the show is making about intelligence without ideology, without love, without the friction of genuinely caring what happens to other people. Maximum efficiency. Maximum horror. There's a moment worth thinking about in relation to Rick C-137's self-awareness about this comparison. Rick knows what he could be. At some level, perhaps not fully articulately, perhaps not in a way he'd ever voice, but at some real functional level, Rick C-137 understands that the version of himself that went further, that removed the emotional complications, that optimized fully, that version is Rick Prime. He's seen it. He's chased it across the multiverse. He knows what pure intelligence without love produces, because he's looked at it directly. And some part of what drives Rick's self-destructive behavior, the drinking, the chaos, the way he periodically seems to be trying to damage himself, might be precisely this. A kind of preemptive sabotage of his own optimization. A way of keeping himself from becoming what he could become if he simply ran clean and clear and unencumbered by love. The alcoholism in this reading isn't just a symptom of grief. It's also a kind of anchor, something that keeps Rick sufficiently mired in human limitation that he can't ascend to the kind of cold perfection Rick Prime achieved. Something that keeps the tool from running at full efficiency, because full efficiency, for a mind like Rick's, produces something he doesn't want to be. The show doesn't make this argument explicitly, but the pieces are there, and they fit together in a way that seems too deliberate to be accidental. Here's a question that emerges from this comparison and doesn't have an easy answer. Is Rick C-137's internal conflict a strength or a weakness? The obvious argument is that it's a weakness. It limits him. It means he's never fully optimized, never running clean, never bringing his entire capability to bear on any single problem, because part of his intelligence is always caught up in managing the emotional dimensions of his life. His love for his family is a hostage that enemies can use against him. His grief is a vulnerability. His values are constraints. In pure tactical terms, Rick Prime, who has none of these constraints, is more capable. But the show pushes back against that conclusion in a specific and interesting way. Rick C-137 has survived through everything, through grief and loss and self-destruction and enemies who were, in various tactical senses, superior to him. He's still here, still connected to people, still, against all his own predictions, part of a family that matters to him. Rick Prime has optimized himself to a point beyond human limitation. And what he has, at the end of all that optimization, is projects. Things to do. No one he'd grieve if they were gone. No anchor, no connection, no reason that isn't purely self-referential. Is that strength? In the narrowest tactical sense, perhaps. In any broader sense, in the sense of what a life is for, in the sense of what makes the extraordinary length and capability of a life like Rick's actually worth the living, it looks like the most complete form of poverty imaginable. The show doesn't resolve this into a clean moral. It doesn't say love is always worth the cost, or that optimization without values is always wrong in every context. But it puts the two outcomes side by side. The constrained, grieving, still connected Rick C-137, and the clean, efficient, utterly alone Rick Prime, and lets the comparison do its work. Evil Morty complicates this binary in a way that's worth sitting with. He's not Rick Prime. He has a genuine ideology, a real value he's pursuing, a goal that goes beyond pure optimization. Freedom is something he actually believes in. The liberation from systems that instrumentalize conscious beings is a real moral commitment, not just a tactical position, but his methods have required him to do to others what he's trying to escape having done to him. He instrumentalized Rick's and Morty's in service of his project. He treated the casualties of his plans as acceptable costs. He became, in his methodology, something that resembles the system he was fighting against, structured around a single overriding goal that treats other people as means rather than ends. That's a genuine moral paradox, and the show is honest about it without resolving it. Does Evil Morty's ideology justify his methods? Does the legitimacy of wanting freedom from a system that systematically abused you justify building your own system of abuse in service of escape? These are real questions, not just fictional ones. And the fact that a cartoon villain is making you ask them, seriously, with genuine uncertainty, without the show providing a comfortable answer, is a mark of how seriously the show takes its own ideas. Let's think about what ideology actually does in the context of these three characters. Why it matters. Why intelligence alone, without ideology, without values, without some orienting principle beyond the next project, produces Rick Prime rather than Rick C-137? Ideology gives intelligence direction, and direction gives intelligence moral character. A mind without direction is just capability. It will do what it's pointed at. It will optimize whatever you ask it to optimize, but the choice of what to optimize, the choice of what matters, what's worth pursuing, what costs are acceptable and what costs aren't, that choice isn't generated by the intelligence. It has to come from somewhere else. For Rick C-137, that somewhere else is love. Messy, performatively denied, poorly expressed love for specific people. It gives his intelligence direction even when he's pretending it doesn't. It's the thing that makes him a protagonist rather than a Rick Prime who drinks more. For Evil Morty, the somewhere else is a genuine moral conviction about the rights of conscious beings to determine their own existence. It gives his intelligence purpose, a real, articulable purpose that generates consistent behavior across years of patient planning. It's what makes him more than just a clever Morty who learned how to fight back. For Rick Prime, there is no somewhere else, or if there is, the show hasn't found it yet. His intelligence runs without direction, or with a direction so internal and self-referential, the next project, then the next, that from the outside it looks like no direction at all. And intelligence without direction, the show argues with some consistency, is not a gift. It's just power, and power without values is not a virtue, no matter how impressive the capability that generates it. There's something the comparison of these three characters reveals about the show's underlying argument that's easy to miss because it's never stated directly. Rick and Morty is not, at its core, a show about how smart people see through the illusions that comfort ordinary people. It's not a show that celebrates intellectual superiority or uses Rick's genius as a model for how to engage with the world. It's a show about the limits of intelligence, about what intelligence can't do, about the specific things that analytical capacity, no matter how extraordinary, simply cannot provide. It can't provide meaning. Rick C-137 understands the mechanics of reality at a level no other being in the show's universe matches, and he still spends his evenings drinking alone in a garage, trying to feel something. It can't provide moral direction. Evil Morty is one of the sharpest strategic minds in the story, and he had to choose what to do with that sharpness from a set of values that his intelligence didn't generate for him. And it can't provide what Rick Prime most completely lacks: a reason to care about anything beyond the next problem to solve. The show's greatest villains are great partly because they embody this argument in different registers. Rick Prime is what pure intelligence without love or ideology produces. Evil Morty is what intelligence with ideology but without love produces. Something more coherent than Rick Prime, but still capable of tremendous damage in the gap between the goal and the people along the way. Rick C-137 is what intelligence with love produces. Divided, conflicted, self-sabotaging, and the most human of the three. The argument isn't that intelligence is bad, or that smart people are doomed to be villains. The argument is that intelligence is just the tool. What you do with it, and what you do with it is always, finally, a function of what you value, is the whole of the moral question. This is also, quietly, why Rick and Morty's treatment of its smartest characters is more interesting than the treatment you find in most science fiction. The classic science fiction premise about extraordinary intelligence is that it generates extraordinary wisdom. That someone who understands how the universe works would, as a consequence of that understanding, know how to live, would have access to truths about meaning and value and the right way to exist that less intelligent beings can only gesture toward. Rick and Morty takes that premise and systematically dismantles it. Rick C-137, for all his genius, is profoundly unhappy and profoundly confused about how to be a person. Evil Morty, for all his clarity of purpose, is building something deeply troubling in service of a goal that's genuinely right. Rick Prime, as the endpoint of maximum intelligence with minimum emotional constraint, is something barely recognizable as a person at all. Intelligence, in the world of Rick and Morty, doesn't grant access to wisdom, it grants access to capability. and capability in the hands of a being without settled values, without love, without some anchor in what actually matters. Capability just makes you more thoroughly whatever you already are. More thoroughly loving if you're Rick C-137, more thoroughly principled if you're Evil Morty, more thoroughly empty if you're Rick Prime. The intelligence amplifies. It doesn't transform. It doesn't redeem. It doesn't produce meaning where there wasn't any. It just makes you faster and more efficient at being who you already are. That's not the message most people expect from a show that spends so much time celebrating its protagonist's genius. But it's the message the show has been delivering, quietly and consistently, across every season. And the three characters at the center of this chapter are its clearest expression. Back to the thought experiment at the start. The three of them in a room. What would the argument actually be about? It would be about whether caring about people is a weakness or the only thing that makes intelligence worth having. Rick Prime would be indifferent to the argument, because arguments about values don't interest him. Evil Morty would make the case that systems are the problem, that individual caring is insufficient, that the only meaningful response to a world that treats people as tools is to dismantle the structural conditions that make that treatment possible. Rick C-137 would drink something, say something dismissive, and then, if pushed, would probably say something he immediately regretted for its honesty. Something about how the only reason he's still here, still in this argument, still in any room with anyone at all, is because of the people he came back for. Not intelligence, not ideology, people. That's the answer the show keeps returning to. Not as a triumphant thesis statement, not as a clean moral lesson, but as a truth that the narrative keeps demonstrating, in spite of its protagonist's best efforts to deny it. Intelligence separates these characters in degree. Ideology separates them in direction. But what finally separates Rick C-137 from the other two, what keeps him, despite everything, on the side of something rather than nothing, is that he loves people and can't stop, no matter how hard he tries to perform otherwise. In the end, that's what ideology can't fully substitute for, and what intelligence can't generate. The show knows it, Rick knows it, even if he'd never say so, and that knowledge, held quietly, expressed indirectly, demonstrated in action rather than stated in speech, is what makes Rick C-137 worth following across however many seasons the story has left to tell. Chapter 5. Why Every Great Villain Needs a Philosophy. Here's something that separates the villains people forget from the ones they carry with them for years. The forgotten ones want things. The unforgettable ones believe things. That distinction is smaller than it sounds, so it's worth pulling apart carefully. Wanting and believing can look similar from the outside. Both produce behavior, both generate goals, both give a character something to pursue across the arc of a story. But they're fundamentally different in terms of what they leave behind in an audience. When a villain wants something, power, money, revenge, domination, the story ends when they get it or fail to get it. The want was the whole of them. Once the want is resolved, one way or another, there's nothing left. The audience has nowhere to go with the character after the story closes. The file shuts cleanly. The character disappears. When a villain believes something, when their actions follow from a worldview, a philosophy, a set of convictions about how reality works and what it demands of the people living in it, then something different happens. The story can end, but the philosophy persists. You carry it with you. You find yourself applying it to situations outside the fiction, testing it, arguing with it, discovering new scenarios where it generates uncomfortable but coherent conclusions. The villain is gone, but their ideas are still running. That's why great villains need philosophy. Not to make them sympathetic, not to make them relatable, but to make them real in a way that survives the story they came from. Rick and Morty has been unusually deliberate about this. Its most memorable antagonists are not defined by what they want. They're defined by what they believe. And what they believe is always specific, coherent, and genuinely in conflict with something the audience cares about, not just something the protagonist cares about. That's the key detail. The philosophy has to be in conflict with something real. Something that the audience, not just the hero, has a stake in. Let's start by mapping the philosophical territories each of the show's major antagonists occupies, because they're distinct and non-overlapping in ways that feel deliberate. Evil Morty's philosophy, at its core, is about liberation from constructed systems. He believes that the world he was born into, the central finite curve, the citadel, the entire architecture of a multiverse filtered to center Rick's significance, is a structure built by and for the powerful, and that any conscious being operating within it is, to varying degrees, being instrumentalized without consent. His conviction isn't just that this is personally bad for him, it's that it's structurally wrong, that the system is illegitimate at its foundation, regardless of whether any individual within it is actively suffering. Rick Prime's philosophy, to the extent it deserves the word, is about the absolute sovereignty of the individual project. He believes, or operates as though he believes, which amounts to the same thing, that consciousness is its own justification, that intelligence applied to interesting problems is its own purpose, and that other conscious beings have no particular claim on you beyond whatever instrumental value they bring to your current work. It's a philosophy of pure self-referential optimization, no external values, no obligations, just the mind and its projects and the universe as raw material. And Rick C-137, who is as much a philosophical position as he is a character, occupies the most complicated territory of all. He's a person who intellectually accepts the nihilistic framework that would justify Rick Prime's behavior, but who is constitutionally unable to live by it. He believes, at the explicit level, that nothing matters. He believes, at the functional level, that certain specific people matter enormously. He has never resolved this contradiction, and the show suggests he never will. 3 philosophies. 3 sets of convictions about what the universe is and what it requires. All held by people of comparable intelligence, all internally coherent, all generating predictable, comprehensible behavior, and all in genuine conflict with each other, not just in the story, but in the ideas themselves. Philosophy in fiction doesn't work the same way philosophy in an academic paper works. In a paper, a philosophical argument is evaluated on its logical structure. Are the premises true? Does the conclusion follow? Are there counterexamples that the argument can't accommodate? The evaluation is intellectual, and the standard is consistency and validity. In fiction, a philosophical argument is evaluated on what it produces. What does this worldview do to a person who actually lives by it? What does it generate in terms of behavior, relationship, emotional life? What does it cost? What does it enable? What does it make impossible? Fiction can test philosophical ideas in ways that academic philosophy can't, because fiction can show you the full consequences of a belief system playing out across a human life, or across what presents as one. You can watch what happens to someone who really, genuinely follows an idea all the way out, and what you see is often more instructive than any logical analysis. Rick and Morty is, at one level, a sustained philosophical experiment. It takes a set of ideas about nihilism, about individual sovereignty, about the meaning of existence in an infinite and indifferent universe, and it runs them, seriously, without flinching, to see what they actually produce in people who actually hold them. Its villains are part of this experiment. They're not just obstacles for the hero, they're test cases. They embody specific philosophical positions, and they live those positions fully, and the audience gets to observe what those positions do when they're not just argued but inhabited. That's why engaging with Rick and Morty's villains feels different from engaging with most animated antagonists. You're not just watching someone do bad things, you're watching an idea at work, and ideas don't disappear when the episode ends. Let's think about freedom as a philosophy, because it's central to Evil Morty in ways that go deeper than his immediate goal. Freedom is one of those concepts that almost everyone agrees is good in the abstract, and almost everyone disagrees about in the specific. Freedom from what? Freedom to do what? Whose freedom when it conflicts with someone else's? What structures are legitimate constraints on freedom, and which are simply the powerful protecting their power by dressing it up as order? These are not abstract questions in Evil Morty's case. He was born into a system that answered them in very specific ways, and the answers systematically disadvantaged him. The Citadel was built by Ricks, run by Ricks, structured to serve Rick's interests, with Morty's slotted into supporting roles that were presented as natural and inevitable, rather than constructed and contingent. Evil Morty looked at that structure clearly enough to see it for what it was. And his philosophy of freedom emerged from that clear vision. He didn't arrive at his convictions through abstract reasoning about the nature of liberty. He arrived at them by examining the specific system he was embedded in and identifying exactly how it worked to limit what he and every other Morty could become. This is philosophically important because it means his freedom isn't an abstract ideal, it's a specific analysis. He can tell you, with precision, what isn't free about the current arrangement and why. He can point to the mechanisms of constraint. He can explain what freedom would actually look like in structural terms, not just as the absence of oppression, but as the positive condition of a multiverse, where the architecture doesn't filter reality to serve one person's centrality. That specificity is what makes his philosophy compelling even to people who are horrified by his methods. Because he's not just saying freedom is good, he's saying this specific thing is wrong, for these specific reasons, and here's what would actually have to change for it to stop being wrong. Specificity makes philosophy credible. Vague appeals to freedom, or justice, or equality are easy to dismiss. They don't cost the person making them anything, they don't commit to anything, they don't generate any real consequences if you accept them. But a specific diagnosis of a specific wrong, explained with enough precision that you can follow the logic all the way through, that demands engagement. You can't just wave it away. Evil Morty won't let you wave him away. His analysis is too precise. His diagnosis is too accurate. Even after he's gone, the question he raised is still sitting there. Was the central finite curve actually wrong? And if it was, what does that mean? Control is the philosophical terrain that the citadel of Ricks occupies more broadly, and it's worth examining because it represents the system that Evil Morty is responding to rather than just the individual villain. The citadel is built on a specific set of philosophical premises about order. That intelligence, concentrated and organized, produces better outcomes than chaos. That the multiverse left to itself is dangerous and inefficient in ways that benefit no one. That some degree of control, exercised by the people best equipped to exercise it, which the Citadel defines as Ricks, is not just pragmatically useful but morally legitimate. There's something recognizable in that argument. Versions of it appear everywhere, that powerful institutions justify their existence. The claim that order is better than chaos, that expertise should govern, that the people running things are running them because they're best suited to it, these are not alien ideas. They're the ideas that most existing power structures use to describe themselves. The Citadel is a satire of institutional self-justification, and it's a sharp one. By building the satire around Ricks, beings who actually are extraordinarily intelligent, who genuinely do have capabilities that far exceed most others, the show prevents you from dismissing the underlying argument too quickly. What if the smartest people really should be running things? What if the order they create, however self-serving, is genuinely better than the alternative? Evil Morty's philosophy of freedom is the direct counter-argument. The answer to, but the order we created is better, is better for whom? Organized by whose standards? And is a system whose primary effect is to concentrate power among those who built it actually producing the outcomes it claims to serve? Or is it producing those outcomes as a byproduct of primarily serving the interests of the people who built it? These questions don't have easy answers. The show doesn't pretend they do. What it does is put the philosophical conflict in motion. Systems philosophy versus liberation philosophy. Control versus freedom. The logic of order versus the logic of autonomy. And let the collision play out in human terms. That collision is what makes the Citadel arc one of the most philosophically rich stretches of animated television ever produced. Not because it reaches clean conclusions, because it takes the ideas seriously enough to follow them. Rick Prime's philosophy, if we continue to grant it that name, raises a genuinely difficult question. Is radical individualism actually a philosophy? Or is it the absence of philosophy? Because what Rick Prime embodies is something that looks, from the outside, like philosophical coherence. He's consistent, his behavior follows from his premises, his internal logic is sound, but might actually be the complete evacuation of the philosophical project. Philosophy, in the oldest sense, is about the question of how to live. What does a good life look like? What do we owe each other? What can we know about the world and ourselves? And what does that knowledge demand of us? These questions assume that living is something that requires thought and commitment and values. That existence isn't its own answer, but a question that needs addressing. Rick Prime doesn't seem to experience existence as a question. He experiences it as a given. He's here, he's intelligent, there are interesting things to do. The question of how to live doesn't arise because he's not trying to live in any meaningful sense. He's simply existing and pursuing projects, and the only standard his existence is measured against is efficiency at the current project. That's a kind of answer to the philosophical question. It's the answer that says the question itself is a category error, that there's no fact of the matter about how to live, and therefore the question dissolves. And what's left is simply, do what interests you. Is that a philosophy? It has internal consistency. It generates clear behavioral guidance. It's not self-contradictory. By most formal standards, it qualifies. But there's something missing from it that every other serious philosophical tradition has tried to address, in different ways and with different emphases. Other people. What we owe each other. The claim that other conscious minds make on us by virtue of their existence. The question of whether intelligence that doesn't acknowledge this claim is genuinely operating at its full capacity, or whether it's systematically blind to a dimension of reality that matters. Rick Prime's philosophy fails, if it fails, at exactly this point. Not in its internal logic, but in what it omits. It's a complete account of a life without anyone else in it. And whether that completeness is a virtue or a catastrophic narrowing depends on what you think consciousness is for. The philosophy of meaning is perhaps the most personal and the most universally resonant of the philosophical territories Rick and Morty explores. It's not primarily located in any single villain. It's distributed across the show, in Rick's nihilism, in Morty's struggle to find reasons to keep going, in the recurring question of whether anything any of them does actually matters, in an infinite, indifferent, endlessly replicating multiverse. But it surfaces most sharply in the moment of confrontation between characters who have answered the meaning question differently. Evil Morty has answered it through purpose. He has a project. Liberation, escape, and that project provides him with a framework for making decisions and evaluating outcomes and knowing whether he's succeeding. Meaning, for Evil Morty, is goal-oriented. It's the sense of progress towards something that matters. Rick Prime has answered it through activity. The project is always there, always interesting, always providing enough forward motion that the question of meaning doesn't have space to arise. He doesn't have meaning, he has occupation. And for someone of his intelligence, occupation and meaning might be effectively indistinguishable in terms of how they feel from the inside. Rick C137 hasn't answered it. That's his defining characteristic in some ways. He's too honest, or too damaged, or too clear-eyed, depending on how generously you're reading him, to accept either of the above answers. Purpose feels arbitrary to him. Any goal he could point to as meaningful can be immediately undermined by the recognition that in infinite universes, the same goal is being pursued and achieved and abandoned across every possible outcome simultaneously. Activity doesn't work either. He has access to more interesting things to do than any being in the universe, and he still ends up alone in the garage at 3 in the morning with a bottle, not particularly wanting to do any of them. What Rick is wrestling with, what he can't resolve and won't stop returning to, is whether meaning is possible at all for someone who understands, at a cellular level, how contingent and arbitrary and cosmically insignificant every particular arrangement of the universe actually is. This is a real philosophical problem, not just a character beat. And the show treats it as one, lets it be hard, lets it be unresolved, lets Rick's inability to answer it be part of who he is, rather than a wound that needs healing. There's a specific philosophical concept that runs through Rick and Morty's treatment of its villains without ever being named explicitly: the concept of authenticity. Authenticity, in the philosophical tradition most associated with existentialism, is the quality of living in accordance with your own genuine values and commitments, rather than in conformity with external expectations or bad faith about who you are. An authentic person knows what they value and lives by it. An inauthentic person either doesn't know what they value or knows but doesn't live by it, performing a life that isn't genuinely theirs. Rick Prime is authentic in the most disturbing possible way. He knows exactly what he values: his own projects, his own experience, nothing and no one else, and he lives by it completely. There's no gap between his stated values and his actual behavior. He is precisely and authentically himself, all the time. Evil Morty is also, in his own way, authentic. He knows what he values. He's been working toward it for years. His behavior is consistent with his convictions. The discomfort he generates comes not from inauthenticity, but from the specific content of his authenticity. from what it is he's genuinely committed to and what he's willing to do in service of it. Rick C-137 is the inauthentic one, in the technical philosophical sense. He performs a set of values, nihilism, indifference, the belief that nothing matters, that are not his actual values. His actual values, love, connection, the specific importance of the specific people he's chosen, are constantly surfacing through the performance, betraying the performance, making the performance visible for what it is. And this inauthenticity is not a failing, or at least not only a failing. It's also a form of protection. Rick can't fully commit to his real values because committing to them means accepting the full weight of loss. The loss he's already experienced, and the future losses that are inevitable if you love people in a universe as violent and chaotic as his. So he performs not caring, so that the caring doesn't become a target, so that the love doesn't become a hostage, so that if he loses someone else, he can tell himself he didn't really invest, didn't really mean it, didn't really make himself vulnerable. The tragedy is that the performance doesn't actually reduce the pain when the loss comes. It just makes the pain harder to process, because it's been happening to someone who was officially claiming not to care. There's something the show understands about philosophical conflict that most fiction gets wrong. Most fiction resolves philosophical conflict by having one side win. The hero's worldview defeats the villain's worldview, not just in the plot, where the hero defeats the villain, but philosophically, where the ideas the hero represents are demonstrated to be correct. This is comfortable. It's also a lie in most cases. Real philosophical conflicts don't resolve that cleanly. The question of freedom versus order doesn't have a final answer. The question of whether individual sovereignty is compatible with moral obligation to others doesn't have a verdict that settles the matter. These are live questions, genuinely contested, and a story that resolves them in 2 hours by having the person representing one side defeat the person representing the other hasn't actually resolved anything. It's just ended the conversation. Rick and Morty refuses this comfort. Its philosophical conflicts don't resolve into clear winners. Evil Morty escapes. His philosophy, his desire for freedom, achieves its goal. The systems he was fighting against are disrupted. Rick is left holding the consequences. But the question of whether the methods were justified, whether the goal sanctified them, whether what Evil Morty did was ultimately right, those questions are still open. The show doesn't close them. It trusts the audience to sit with them. Rick Prime is defeated, eventually, but his defeat doesn't refute his philosophy. The logic that organized his life doesn't become wrong because he lost. It remains internally consistent. What we can say about it is that it produced a life that looked, from the outside, like the most complete loneliness imaginable. But Rick Prime might not have experienced it that way, and the show doesn't pretend to know whether he did. This openness, this refusal to use narrative resolution as philosophical resolution, is what gives the show's ideas their staying power. Because you can't dismiss a question just because the character holding it was defeated. The question is still there. It's asking you, personally, what you think. Let's think specifically about what it means for an audience to argue with a villain's philosophy. When a villain's worldview is clear enough to engage with, when you understand exactly what they believe and why, and when that belief is internally coherent enough that you can follow its logic, something happens in the audience that doesn't happen with ordinary antagonists. You start thinking about whether they're right. Not whether they're right to do what they do. That question has easy answers in most cases. But whether the underlying conviction, the premise from which the behavior follows, is correct. Is Evil Morty right that the central finite curve was a fundamental moral wrong? Probably yes. Does that rightness justify the methods he used to dismantle it? That's harder, much harder. The show doesn't answer it, and you find yourself turning it over. Is Rick Prime right that the universe doesn't confer intrinsic value on conscious beings? That's a genuinely live philosophical question that serious thinkers have argued about for centuries. The show doesn't resolve it. It just shows you what it looks like when someone operates as though the answer is yes, and lets you decide what you make of that. Is Rick C-137's performed nihilism more honest than his actual love, or is his actual love more honest than his performed nihilism? Is authenticity about what you consciously endorse, or about what you actually live by? These are real questions with real stakes, and the character embodies them so completely that engaging with him means engaging with them. This is what philosophy in fiction is for. Not to arrive at answers, to make the questions live, to put you in genuine contact with ideas that matter, ideas about freedom and meaning and what we owe each other, and what it means to be a person, in a context vivid enough that you can't just process them abstractly. You have to feel them, and feeling them is what makes them persist. Power is the final philosophical territory worth examining, because it runs through all of Rick and Morty's antagonists in ways that aren't always obvious. Each of the major villains has access to extraordinary power, and each of them has a different relationship to it that tells you something essential about what they believe. Evil Morty acquires power instrumentally. He builds it, patiently, because he needs it to achieve the goal that precedes the power. The power is never the point, it's the means. And once he's used it to do what he needed to do, he walks away from it, steps through the portal and leaves the Citadel, the presidency, all the accumulated influence behind. He doesn't want to hold power. He wants to be free of the systems that require power to navigate. Rick Prime has power because power follows naturally from his intelligence and his willingness to use that intelligence without ethical constraints. He doesn't pursue power as a goal either. But unlike Evil Morty, he doesn't walk away from it. He just doesn't particularly think about it. It's there when he needs it and irrelevant when he doesn't. Power is a resource, like any other. Rick C-137 has power, perhaps the most raw capability of the three, and he consistently misuses it, dissipates it, refuses to consolidate it. He's had opportunities to hold extraordinary institutional power, and he's rejected them or destroyed them. The Citadel offered him a kind of empire at various points, and he wanted nothing to do with it. His relationship to power is almost phobic, as though he understands at some level what power would do to him if he allowed himself to fully inhabit it. What does that tell us? It tells us that power, for Rick C-137, is dangerous precisely because of what he values. If he allowed himself to fully acquire and hold power, it would compromise the thing that keeps him different from Rick Prime. It would optimize him, remove the friction, make him efficient in ways that would require him to stop being the specific, messy, self-contradictory person he is. He keeps the power at arm's length, not because he doesn't have it, but because he knows what happens when someone like him stops holding it at arm's length. He's looked at Rick Prime, he knows. What does philosophy ultimately provide that mere power or intelligence can't? It provides an answer to the question, what is this for? Intelligence and power are amplifiers. They make you more of what you already are. They don't tell you what you should be, what you should use them for, what makes the extraordinary capacity worth having. Those answers have to come from somewhere else. Philosophy, real philosophy, the kind embedded in how you actually live rather than the kind you perform, is where those answers live. It's the deep structure of a person's values, the organizing principles that determine where the intelligence goes and what the power does and what the suffering means. Evil Morty's philosophy gives his intelligence direction and his power purpose. It doesn't make his methods right, but it makes him coherent in a way that demands engagement. Rick Prime's lack of philosophy, or his philosophy-shaped hole, makes his intelligence directionless and his power purposeless. He's maximally capable and minimally oriented, the most efficient expression of capability the show has ever produced, and the emptiest. Rick C-137's messy, conflicted, poorly expressed philosophy of specific love gives his intelligence its friction and its purpose simultaneously. The love is what makes him difficult. It's also what makes him someone worth following. The show is arguing, through these three, that philosophy is not an optional add-on to capability. It's the thing that determines what capability is for. Take it away, and you have Rick Prime. Simplify it to a single principle without love, and you have Evil Morty. Hold it imperfectly, contradictorily, with enormous cost and enormous pain, and you have Rick C-137. And Rick C-137, for all his chaos and damage and self-destruction, is the one who's still here, still connected, still, despite everything, part of something that matters. That's not an accident. That's the show's deepest argument, and it's one that the villains, precisely by embodying the alternatives, make impossible to ignore. Chapter 6. The Art of Mystery. Think about the last time a story genuinely surprised you. Not the mechanical surprise of a plot twist you didn't see coming, the kind where information is withheld and then released, and your brain registers the update and you move on. That's a trick. Tricks are fine. They work in the moment and then they're done. Think about a different kind of surprise. The kind that arrives quietly, without fanfare, in a scene that isn't even trying to be dramatic. The kind where a small piece of information lands and something shifts in your understanding, not just of the plot, but of the whole shape of what you've been watching, where you suddenly see something you've been looking at for years in a different light, where the past reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. That kind of surprise requires patience. It requires a story that's been holding something back, not because it's trying to trick you, but because it knows that some truths are only available to people who've been looking long enough to recognize them when they appear. Rick and Morty has that kind of patience. It's one of the show's most undervalued qualities, and it's central to why its greatest antagonists work the way they do. Mystery. Real mystery, the kind that's built rather than just withheld, is the structural principle that makes Evil Morty haunting rather than just clever. It's what makes Rick Prime feel enormous even before you fully understand what he is. It's what gives the show's most significant reveals the weight they carry, rather than the lightness of a simple plot surprise. Understanding how Rick and Morty builds and maintains mystery is understanding one of the most important techniques in its entire storytelling arsenal. There's a distinction worth making early, because it's the foundation of everything else in this chapter: the difference between a secret and a mystery. A secret is information that exists but is being withheld. The story knows what it is. The audience senses that it exists. The dramatic energy comes from the gap between what the audience suspects and what the story hasn't yet confirmed. Eventually, the secret is revealed, and the gap closes, and the dramatic energy dissipates. The secret was a container, and once the container was opened, there was nothing left of the container itself. A mystery is different. A mystery isn't just withheld information. It's an open question whose full answer may not exist anywhere. A mystery isn't a container waiting to be opened. It's a shape that keeps generating new dimensions the longer you look at it. When you learn more about a mystery, you don't feel like the gap is closing. You feel like the space is expanding. The new information doesn't answer the question. It makes the question more interesting. The best mysteries in storytelling are ones where the reveal, when it comes, doesn't end the mystery. It deepens it. It gives you something new to wonder about. It changes the question rather than answering it. Rick and Morty builds mystery rather than secrets. And that distinction explains why Evil Morty, even after his arc reaches what functions as a conclusion, is still occupying space in the audience's imagination. Because his story wasn't a secret that got revealed. It was a mystery that grew. Let's trace exactly how Evil Morty's mystery was constructed, because the craftsmanship is worth examining closely. The first appearance is minimal: an eye patch removed, a yellow eye, a small controlled expression. The scene is at the end of an episode whose primary concerns were elsewhere. Evil Morty's existence is revealed as an afterthought, almost. An extra beat in the closing moments. That placement is deliberate. By putting the reveal at the end of an episode rather than at its center, the writers signal to the audience that they're not going to immediately explain what they've just shown you. They're not going to follow it up with exposition or context or a villain monologue that tells you what to make of what you've seen. They showed you something, and now the episode is over, and you're going to have to sit with it until the show decides to say more. What the minimal reveal does is establish presence without establishing nature. You know Evil Morty exists. You know he's capable of something significant. The scheme you just watched unfold required intelligence and patience and planning. You know he has a history, because nobody develops that kind of capability without one. But you don't know what he wants, where he came from, why the yellow eye, what the whole thing means. The mystery is established through what isn't shown. This is counterintuitive for most storytelling instincts. The natural impulse is that presence requires explanation, that when you introduce something significant, you also introduce its context, so the audience knows what they're dealing with. Mystery, in this conventional view, is something you build toward a reveal, something the story is working to resolve. Rick and Morty inverts this. The mystery isn't working toward resolution. The mystery is the point. The absence of explanation isn't a temporary state to be corrected. It's the core of the character's power. Consider what happens in the audience between Evil Morty appearances. The gap between close Rick counters of the Rick kind in Season 1 and the next significant Evil Morty appearance in Season 3 is substantial. During that gap, across a full season of episodes, through all the other characters and stories and plots, Evil Morty remains unaddressed. The show doesn't bring him up, doesn't explain him, doesn't offer any new information, and yet he's there, in the background of the audience's attention. The open file that keeps getting visited even when there's nothing new to add to it. This is the psychological mechanism that mystery exploits. Human brains are completion machines. When something is incomplete, when there's a question without an answer, a story without an ending, a character without a context, the brain doesn't let it rest. It keeps returning to it, keeps looking for new angles, keeps trying to assemble what's available into a complete picture. Evil Morty gave the audience just enough to make the file worth keeping open, and not enough to close it. And for the gap between appearances, the audience was doing the work of keeping him present, thinking about him, theorizing about him, filling the space the show had deliberately left open with their own imagination. When you generate this kind of active, imaginative investment in an audience, something significant happens. The character stops being entirely the show's creation and becomes partly the audience's. The Evil Morty that individual viewers carried through the gap years between appearances was shaped partly by what the show provided and partly by what each viewer's own imagination added to it. That personal investment creates a depth of attachment that no amount of screen time could manufacture. Absence in storytelling is underused as a tool, and Rick and Morty understands its power better than almost any other animated series. Most storytellers are afraid of absence. The fear is that if a character isn't present, the audience will forget them, will move on, will stop caring. So the impulse is to keep everything present, to keep all the important characters visible, to never let significant elements of the story go quiet for too long. This fear is understandable but misplaced. What actually happens when a significant character disappears is not that the audience forgets them. What happens is that the audience starts wondering about them. And wondering is a form of engagement that's more active than watching. When you watch a character, the story is doing the work of keeping them present in your mind. When you wonder about a character, you're doing that work yourself. And the work you do yourself is more deeply integrated, more personally meaningful, more durably remembered. Absence creates wondering, and wondering creates investment, and investment creates the kind of emotional connection that makes a character persist long after the story is over. Evil Morty's disappearance after his first appearance isn't the show failing to follow up on a promising character. It's the show weaponizing absence. It's the story handing the audience a question and then walking away, trusting that the audience will keep holding the question rather than dropping it, and they did, for years. There's another dimension of Rick and Morty's mystery building that goes beyond the management of individual characters. The show creates what might be called layered revelation, a structure where what appears to be a complete explanation turns out to be a layer over a deeper reality, which turns out to be a layer over a deeper reality still. The citadel of Ricks appears to be simply a political satire, a society of Ricks organized into bureaucratic and economic hierarchies that mirror and satirize real-world systems. And it is that, but underneath the satire is something else, an exploration of what it means for copies of the same person to develop into completely different individuals depending on their experiences, which is itself a layer over something deeper, a meditation on identity, on whether the self is something intrinsic or something produced by circumstance. And underneath all of that is the central finite curve, the revelation that the entire accessible multiverse has been artificially constructed to center Rick's significance, which reframes everything about the Citadel and everything about Rick's universe and everything about the way the show has presented its cosmology from the beginning. Each layer felt complete at the time. Each layer was genuinely the thing it appeared to be. And each layer was also preparation for the next layer, which couldn't have landed with the same weight if the previous layers hadn't been real. That's sophisticated mystery construction, not a misdirection that reveals a trick. A genuine deepening, each revelation expanding the space rather than closing it. Foreshadowing in Rick and Morty functions differently from foreshadowing in most long-form narratives. Conventional foreshadowing plants signals that the audience may or may not notice, which then pay off when the foreshadowed event occurs. The payoff is the pleasure, the recognition that the story knew where it was going, that what seemed incidental was actually meaningful, that you were being trusted with information whose significance wasn't yet clear. Rick and Morty does this too, but it does something else as well, which is harder to name. It plants signals that pay off in ways that exceed the specific event they're foreshadowing. Signals that turn out to be pointing at something larger than any single revelation. At a structural truth about the show's universe or its characters that recontextualizes not just the specific foreshadowed event, but everything around it. The details of Rick's grief, scattered across early seasons in moments that read as character texture rather than plot material, The way he drinks, the way he talks about Beth, the specific contours of his emotional unavailability turn out to be foreshadowing not just for the revelation about Rick Prime, but for a complete architecture of loss that was always structuring the character and only becomes fully visible once you have enough pieces. You don't notice the foreshadowing on first viewing, you notice it on reflection, after you have more information. And the retroactive recognition, the moment where you go back and see what was always there, is one of the most pleasurable experiences a narrative can produce. But Rick and Morty earns this pleasure rather than manufacturing it. The signals are real, the connections are genuine. It's not retroactive foreshadowing created by the writers after the fact. It's the honest result of a show that knew more about its characters than it was showing at any given moment. Silence as a storytelling tool is worth examining in its own right, because the show uses it with unusual discipline. Silence. Moments where characters don't explain what they're feeling, where the camera holds on something without commentary, where music stops and the visual is left to carry the full weight of the moment, is one of the rarest and most powerful tools available to visual storytelling. It's rare because it requires confidence. Most storytelling is afraid to be quiet, because quiet requires the audience to do work, and doing work requires engagement that might not be there. Rick and Morty trusts its audience to do that work. It has, since early in its run, been willing to end scenes without resolving them emotionally. To let characters carry things that the show doesn't immediately explain or contextualize. To hold images, a garage lit by the glow of failed experiments, a figure walking through a portal without looking back, without telling you what to feel about them. The most significant silences in the show tend to cluster around its most significant characters. Rick's quietest moments, the ones where the performance drops, briefly, and something genuine surfaces, are almost never explained. The show shows you the moment and then moves on, trusting that you felt what it was without needing to be told. Evil Morty's silences are especially important. The controlled expression when the eye patch comes off, the stillness during his political speech at the Citadel, the quality of someone who has thought about every word so many times that the words themselves have become smooth, worn down, requiring no effort. The moment before he steps through the portal at the end of his arc. These silences are doing enormous work. They're the spaces where the audience fills in what the character is thinking and feeling, and in filling that space, the audience commits to the character in a way that explicit exposition would never achieve. There's something worth examining about the relationship between mystery and trust. When a story maintains genuine mystery, when it withholds information not as a trick, but as a structural commitment to letting things develop at their own pace, it's making an implicit agreement with the audience. It's saying, we know things you don't yet. We know them for a reason. We're holding them back not to frustrate you, but because the time isn't right. Because the pieces need to accumulate before the picture can be seen. Because some truths are only available to people who've been patient. That agreement requires trust. The audience has to trust that what's being withheld is worth waiting for. That the mystery isn't empty, isn't being maintained because the writers don't have an answer, but because they do, and they're taking the time to set it up properly. Rick and Morty built that trust across its early seasons by consistently delivering on its mysteries. The things it withheld were worth waiting for. The reveals expanded rather than diminished. The answers, when they came, were genuinely better than any reasonable expectation would have predicted. Not just satisfying, but generative. They produced new questions, new dimensions, new things to think about. Once that trust is established, mystery becomes even more powerful. Because you know, as an audience member, that the thing you're wondering about will eventually matter, that the question you're holding isn't a red herring, that the show is holding things back in good faith, that knowledge changes how you hold the mystery. Instead of skepticism, are they even going to address this? You have anticipation, a confident forward lean into the unknown, because you've learned that what's unknown in this story tends to be worth knowing. Let's think about how mystery functions specifically in relation to Rick Prime, because it operates somewhat differently than the Evil Morty case. Evil Morty's mystery is primarily external. What is he? Where did he come from? What does he want? The questions are about the character's nature and intention. Rick Prime's mystery is primarily emotional. The facts about him become clear relatively quickly. What he did, when, how, what it produced. The question is not what he is, but what he means. What it means for Rick C-137 that this person exists. What it means for the audience's understanding of Rick to know that this is the wound, that this is the source, that this is the thing that made everything else. This is a different kind of mystery. It's the mystery of significance rather than the mystery of identity, and it's sustained not by withholding information, but by the emotional complexity of the information that's available. You know what Rick Prime did. You know when and why and roughly how. But the question of what to feel about it, what Rick is supposed to do with it, how grief this foundational is supposed to be addressed, whether catching Rick Prime would give Rick anything he's actually missing, those questions don't resolve just because the facts are known. They're mysteries of a different order. The kind that don't yield to information. The kind that only yield, if they yield at all, to time and experience and the slow accumulation of living with them. Rick C-137 has been living with his for decades. The audience has been living with theirs for however long they've been watching. And neither set of questions is anywhere near resolution. That parallel between Rick's relationship to his mystery and the audience's relationship to theirs is part of what makes the Rick Prime arc feel so personal. You're not watching Rick work through something from the outside, you're working through something alongside him. The mystery belongs to both of you equally. Here's a specific technique worth naming, because it's one Rick and Morty uses regularly and with great effect. The technique is significant information delivered in an insignificant moment. Most storytelling delivers important reveals dramatically. Special music, particular camera angles, pacing that signals to the audience, this is the moment. Pay attention, this matters. Rick and Morty sometimes does this, but its most lasting reveals, the ones that work their way deepest into the audience's experience, often arrive without ceremony, dropped casually into the middle of something else. Mentioned as an aside before the scene moves on to its apparent main concern. This technique works because it mimics something true about how significant things happen in real life. The most important moments often don't announce themselves. The conversation that changes everything is sometimes the one that started as small talk. The sentence that alters your understanding arrives in the middle of a paragraph about something else. Life doesn't use special music. When fiction does this, when it trusts the audience to catch something significant without being told it's significant, it creates a particular quality of intimacy. The audience feels trusted. They feel like they're paying close enough attention to notice things the show didn't need to underline. They feel, in a small but real way, like they're inside the story rather than outside watching it. And they carry what they caught more closely, because they found it rather than being handed it. Because the discovery feels, at least partially, like their own. The central finite curve reveal is worth examining as a case study in long-form mystery, because it's one of the most complex and carefully prepared mysteries the show has ever executed. The reveal itself, that the entire accessible multiverse had been filtered to contain only universes where Rick was the smartest being alive, arrives in Season 5, but the ground for it was being prepared from the beginning of the series. Every time the show depicted the multiverse as a place where Rick moved with exceptional freedom, where he was always the most capable entity in any given situation, where the universe seemed almost designed to showcase his genius, it was planting the seed. Not dishonestly. All of those things were true, but the framing that made them seem like facts about the multiverse in general was quietly not quite right, in ways that only became visible retrospectively. The Citadel itself was foreshadowing, in a sense. A society built by Ricks, organized around Rick's interests, structured to protect and extend Rick's influence. That's not just a political satire. It's a smaller-scale version of the central finite curve itself, a constructed space designed to center Rick. The Citadel is the curve, miniaturized. And once you see that, you can see that the idea was always present in the show's architecture. The reveal lands with such force partly because the mystery was so well prepared. You didn't know you were sitting inside a mystery about the nature of the multiverse. You thought you knew what the multiverse was. And then you learned that what you knew was a selection, that the apparent facts had been shaped by a filter you didn't know was there. That's a genuinely rare achievement. Most reveals change what you know about the plot. This one changed what you knew about the world the plot was happening in. The frame shifted rather than just the picture inside it. Mystery creates one particular emotional experience that's worth naming directly, because it's different from the emotions that other storytelling techniques produce. Mystery creates longing, not just curiosity. Curiosity is intellectual, not just anticipation. Anticipation is forward-looking. Longing is something more persistent and more personal. It's the ache of an open question held over time. The feeling of wanting to know something and not yet knowing it, sustained long enough that the wanting becomes part of how you experience the story. You longed to know what Evil Morty was, really know him, understand where he came from, what happened to him, what he believes, what he's building. The longing was part of the experience of watching the show. It shaped what you paid attention to. It made you lean forward. And then the pieces came, slowly. And the longing was partly resolved and partly deepened into new longing. Not disappointment, not the deflation of a mystery whose answer wasn't worth the wait, but the particular satisfaction of a mystery that answered what it answered and then generated new questions from its answers. That cycle, longing, partial resolution, new longing, is the heartbeat of a well-maintained mystery. It keeps the audience engaged not just in the passive sense of continuing to watch, but in the active sense of actually caring about what happens, of investing emotional energy in the outcome. Rick and Morty has maintained this cycle across its entire run, with its greatest mysteries, and the characters at the center of those mysteries, Evil Morty, Rick Prime, and the slowly revealing interior life of Rick C-137 himself, are the ones that audiences are still thinking about years later. There's one final dimension of Rick and Morty's relationship with mystery that deserves attention before we move on. The show is honest about the limits of mystery. It doesn't pretend that all questions will be answered. It doesn't imply that if you wait long enough, everything will become clear. It holds its mysteries with the same honesty it brings to its philosophical questions, openly acknowledging that some things don't resolve, that some shapes remain incomplete, that some doors that were shown to exist might never be opened. This honesty is part of what makes the mystery feel real, rather than manufactured. Real mysteries don't always resolve. Real questions about people, why they did what they did, what they were really feeling, what they're building toward, sometimes stay open. The person leaves or changes or closes themselves off, and you're left with what you have, which is some pieces and some guesses and a shape that you can sense without being able to fully see. Evil Morty's mystery is honest in this way. You know more than you did. You don't know everything. What happened to him before the show picked him up? The specific texture of the damage, the particular shape of the relationship with his Rick that produced what he became, remains unshown. Maybe permanently. And that permanent incompleteness, that honest acknowledgement that some things about a person aren't going to be available to you, that's one of the most truthful things the show has ever done. Because it mirrors the experience of knowing real people who are always more than what they show, always carrying more than what they say, always remaining finally somewhat opaque even to those who love them most. Mystery, honestly maintained, is one of the most human qualities a story can have. And Rick and Morty, at its best, is one of the most human shows ever made about the absurdity and terror and strange beauty of existing. Chapter 7. Why Villains Should Change the Hero. There's a test you can apply to any villain in any story, and the result tells you almost everything about whether the villain was truly well-built or merely serviceable. The test is this: remove the villain from the story entirely. Imagine they never existed. And then ask, is the hero the same person? If the hero is essentially unchanged, if they would have arrived at the same place, held the same values, made the same choices, carried the same emotional weight, then the villain wasn't really a villain in the deepest sense. They were an obstacle, a series of events that needed to be navigated, a plot mechanism dressed in a face and a motivation. But if removing the villain changes the hero fundamentally, if the hero without this particular antagonist would be a different person, would see the world differently, would value different things, would carry themselves through every subsequent scene in a different way, then the villain achieved something real, something permanent, something that the story will carry forward even after the villain is gone. This is the highest standard for antagonism in storytelling. Not, did the villain threaten the hero? Not, did the villain win impressive battles or demonstrate frightening capability? Not, was the villain clever or memorable or philosophically interesting in isolation? But did the villain change the hero? Did they leave a mark that didn't heal? Did they alter something about the protagonist that every future scene reflects, whether the villain is present or not? Rick and Morty has built its greatest antagonists around this standard. And looking at what Evil Morty and Rick Prime did to Rick C-137, really looking at it, tracking the specific changes across seasons, reveals storytelling of genuine depth. Let's start with who Rick C-137 was before. Before what? Before the losses. Before Rick Prime. Before the wound that organized everything else. The show gives us only fragments of this version of Rick. Glimpses rather than a full portrait. A younger man who was building something ordinary and profound. A life, a family, a home in the conventional sense. Who had a wife he loved. Who was going to have a daughter. Who was choosing, at a critical moment in what would become his defining divergence from Rick Prime, to reject the path of pure optimization in favor of something smaller and more human. That Rick, pre-wound Rick, the Rick who still believed in the possibility of an ordinary life, is mostly available to us through absence, through what the Rick we know is conspicuously not, through the silences and deflections and performed indifferences that trace the shape of something that was once present and is no longer. He was capable of hope in a way that Rick C-137, as we know him, is not. He was capable of investment in a future, in a version of things going well that didn't have to be ironized or protected by nihilistic detachment. He was building towards something in the ordinary human sense, and he believed it was possible to build toward it. That Rick exists in the show primarily as a ghost, as the photographic negative of who Rick C-137 became, as the person you can see most clearly by looking at everything the Rick we know refuses to be. And the relationship between that ghost and the antagonists who produced him is the emotional substrate the show has been building on since the beginning. Rick Prime's effect on Rick C-137 is the most fundamental of the changes, because it happened first and it set the conditions for everything else. What Rick Prime took from Rick was not just family, though that loss was enormous and real and didn't heal. What Rick Prime took was Rick's relationship to the future. Before the attack, Rick C-137 was oriented forward. His intelligence, his extraordinary capability, was pointing towards something, toward the life he was building, toward the people he was building it with, toward a version of the future he was genuinely invested in. After the attack, the orientation inverted. Rick C-137 became a person defined not by what he was moving toward, but by what he was moving away from. Away from vulnerability, away from genuine investment, away from the kind of hope that, once disappointed at this scale, became a form of danger rather than a form of energy. This is a specific and recognizable psychological shift, and the show handles it with unusual honesty. Rick didn't become cruel after losing his family. He didn't become violent or nihilistic in a showy way. He became defended. Elaborately, comprehensively defended. He built a personality, the Rick we know, with his chaos and his alcohol and his performed indifference and his genius deployed as armor that was specifically engineered to prevent the conditions that allowed the wound to happen. If you don't love anyone, you can't lose anyone. If you don't build toward a future can't be taken. If you stay moving, if you keep everything light and provisional and subject to revision, then nothing can be destroyed because nothing was ever fixed in place. This is the Rick that Rick Prime created. Not through intention, not through any deliberate plan to shape Rick C-137 into a particular kind of person, but through the specific nature of the damage. The wound created its own scar tissue, and the scar tissue determined the shape of everything that followed. The tragedy of this, and the show is genuinely tragic in its treatment of Rick, whatever its comic surface might suggest, is that the defense didn't actually work. Rick is still capable of love. Despite everything, despite all the elaborate architecture of performed indifference and nihilistic detachment and chaos as lifestyle, the love is still there, leaking through every defensive structure he built to contain it, visible in precisely the moments where he tries hardest to pretend it isn't. His relationship with Morty is the clearest evidence. Rick insists, repeatedly and with considerable rhetorical sophistication, that his attachment to Morty is instrumental, that Morty is useful, that he needs someone with a certain brainwave frequency, that the relationship is practical rather than personal. The show systematically makes a liar of him. Across season after season, in moment after moment, Rick's behavior reveals an attachment to Morty that goes far beyond utility. He protects Morty in ways that cost him. He makes decisions that privilege Morty's well-being over his own interests. He is, in ways he'd furiously deny, a person for whom Morty matters enormously. So the defense created by Rick Prime's destruction of Rick's family didn't eliminate Rick's capacity for love. It just made that capacity secret, hidden, protected behind layers of performance that Rick maintains at enormous psychological cost, specifically to prevent anyone, including himself, from knowing how exposed he still is. That's the shape of what Rick Prime did to him. Not removal of feeling, but enforced concealment. Not the elimination of connection, but its exile to the interior, where it can't be threatened but also can't be fully lived. Evil Morty's effect on Rick is different in character, because the relationship is different. Rick Prime is the author of Rick's fundamental wound. Evil Morty is something else. A confrontation with the implications of that wound, and with the system that Rick's wound created. Here's the strange and uncomfortable truth about Rick's relationship to the Citadel and to the central finite curve. Rick didn't build them with benevolent intentions. The Citadel is a Rick's-built institution that serves Rick interests, and the central finite curve, the deliberate filtering of the accessible multiverse to only include universes where Rick is the smartest person alive, represents, at some level, the universe arranged to protect and validate Rick's intelligence. Whether Rick C-137 personally constructed the curve, whether he endorsed it, whether he was even fully aware of its implications, these are questions the show leaves deliberately complex. But his relationship to the system is not simply that of an innocent bystander. He exists at the top of a hierarchy that the curve enables. He benefits from a construction that makes his intelligence the defining parameter of accessible reality. Evil Morty tears that down, and in tearing it down, he confronts Rick, not directly, not through dialogue, but through the sheer fact of what he does, with a question about what Rick's intelligence actually means. What it's worth, whether the universe it created, the hierarchy it enabled, the system it centered, whether any of that was actually good. Rick watches Evil Morty dismantle the system and walk away. And what he's left with, on the other side of that dismantling, is a multiverse that's genuinely open again. Infinite in the full sense, no longer filtered to center him. That shift, from a universe organized around Rick's significance to a universe indifferent to it, is one of the most significant things that happens to Rick across the entire series. Because Rick's intelligence has always been, at some level, his answer to everything. The thing he has when he doesn't have anything else. The quality that makes his existence feel justified, even when it doesn't feel good. He's the smartest person in the universe. Whatever else is true, whatever else he's lost, whatever failures of connection and relationship and ordinary happiness have accumulated across his life, there's that. The intelligence, the capability, the knowledge that he understands more than anyone else. The central finite curve guaranteed that this answer was always available. Every universe Rick could access was one where he was the most capable entity. His intelligence wasn't just a personal quality, it was cosmologically confirmed. The multiverse itself was organized to validate it. When Evil Morty destroys the curve, that guarantee disappears. The universes where Rick might not be the smartest thing in the room become accessible. The infinite multiverse, ungoverned by Rick's centrality, opens up. And Rick has to sit with what that means. Not just strategically, though it has strategic implications, but existentially. The thing he's been using as an answer turns out to have been answer in a constructed context. What happens to the answer when the construction falls? This is what Evil Morty did to Rick. Not just disrupted the Citadel, not just escaped, but removed one of the foundations of Rick's self-understanding. And the show, characteristically, doesn't immediately resolve what Rick does with that removal. It leaves the question open. It lets Rick carry it forward. There's a specific type of villain effect on a hero that's worth naming here, because it shows up in both the Evil Morty and Rick Prime arcs in different forms. The type is the villain as mirror. A villain who functions as a mirror doesn't just threaten the hero, they reflect something about the hero back at the hero in a way the hero can't deflect or ignore. They hold up a version of the hero that the hero has been avoiding looking at, and the confrontation with that reflection becomes its own form of damage. Rick Prime is the most obvious mirror. He's what Rick could have become without the grief, without the love, without the wound that, in a horrible paradox, preserved Rick's humanity by destroying Rick's peace. Every time Rick looks at Rick Prime, every time he chases him, researches him, imagines confronting him, he's looking at a version of himself that chose optimization over connection and is seeing, in full detail, what that choice produces. That mirror is not comfortable. There's something Rick Prime has that Rick C-137 lacks. A clean, undivided intelligence. A life without grief. A freedom from the complications that make Rick C-137 both more human and more damaged. And there's something Rick C-137 has that Rick Prime lacks. Connection, meaning, the specific love for specific people that makes life more than a series of interesting problems. Forcing Rick to look at that comparison, to hold both sides of it at once, to see clearly what was preserved by the wound and what was destroyed by it, is what the Rick-Prime relationship ultimately does to Rick as a character. It's the mirror he can't look away from, even though what it shows him is almost unbearable. Evil Morty functions as a different kind of mirror. He shows Rick not what Rick might have been, but what Rick's existence in the multiverse actually looks like from the outside. From the perspective of someone who was shaped by a Rick and survived it, and had opinions about what that process involved. Rick, from inside his own experience, is a complicated person, doing his best in difficult circumstances. Rick, from Evil Morty's vantage point, is a representative of a system that built itself around Rick's significance and in doing so, made everyone else in that system smaller. Both views contain truth. Neither is complete, and holding both simultaneously is what looking at Evil Morty requires of Rick. The question of whether villains should be allowed to win is worth thinking about in this context. Most storytelling answers this question the same way. The villain can win battles, but the hero wins the war. Individual losses are permitted, even required, to generate stakes. But the fundamental momentum of the story moves toward the hero's eventual success. Rick and Morty has been willing to deviate from this in meaningful ways, and the deviations are part of what makes the villain relationships feel genuinely weighty. Evil Morty wins, completely. He achieves what he set out to achieve. The central finite curve is destroyed. He escapes. Rick is left with the consequences of that escape. The villain's plan succeeds, and the hero is changed by the success of the plan rather than by its defeat. Rick Prime is eventually confronted, and Rick gets the encounter he's been building toward, but the aftermath of that confrontation doesn't restore what was lost. The grief doesn't resolve. The absence that Rick Prime created by killing Rick's family doesn't become presence just because Rick Prime is gone. The victory, if it is one, is hollow in a way the show doesn't try to fill. These outcomes matter for what they teach the audience about the villains. If Evil Morty had been defeated, if his plan had failed and Rick had prevented the destruction of the curve, then Evil Morty's philosophy would have been narratively dismissed. The story would have said, through the mechanics of its plot, that the system was worth preserving, that Rick's centrality was legitimate, that the desire for liberation was wrong because it was defeated. By letting Evil Morty win, the show leaves his philosophy unrefuted. His analysis stands, his goal was achieved, and the question of whether his methods were justified remains genuinely open precisely because the question of whether his goal was right is not answered by his defeat, because there is no defeat. That's honest. And honesty about villains, acknowledging when they're right, allowing them to succeed when their goals have genuine validity, is what gives them permanent moral weight rather than the temporary moral weight that comes with being a defeated antagonist. Let's think about what Morty carries from his encounters with the show's greatest antagonists, because the change isn't only Rick's. Morty's relationship to Evil Morty is one of the most complex in the show, precisely because of the identification it creates. Evil Morty is a Morty, the specific Rick-Morty dynamic that the show has been exploring from its beginning. The relationship of uncertainty and occasional exploitation and genuine love and compromised autonomy is exactly what Evil Morty came from and what he's responding to. When Morty watches Evil Morty, he's watching a version of himself that decided to stop being what Rick needed him to be. That decision, the decision to prioritize one's own existence over the role one has been cast in, is one that Morty can never fully make. Not because he lacks the capability, but because Morty's love for Rick is real and not strategic. He doesn't want to escape Rick. He wants the relationship to work, wants the connection to be what it sometimes feels like it could be, wants the family structure he's found himself in to mean what he needs it to mean. Evil Morty represents the path Morty didn't take, and that path is both a warning and a rebuke. A warning about what happens to a Morty who decides the relationship isn't worth the cost, and a rebuke to Morty's acceptance of a role that Evil Morty has demonstrated was never simply natural. That's a change Morty carries forward. A complexity in his relationship to his own position, to what it means to be Rick's Morty, to what being Rick's Morty costs, to whether the costs are being honestly acknowledged, and whether the relationship is as mutual as it sometimes presents itself. He doesn't resolve this. He carries it, and the carrying of it, unresolved, is what a genuine villain encounter leaves in its wake. There's a moment in the Rick and Morty narrative, not a single scene but a cumulative moment, a quality that emerges across many scenes, where you notice that Rick is different from who he was. Not healed, not resolved, not better in any clean sense, but different, carrying something new in addition to what he was already carrying, seeing himself slightly differently, moving through the universe with a slightly altered orientation. That quality, that subtle, permanent difference, is the mark of a villain who truly worked. Who didn't just threaten or oppose, but genuinely altered. Evil Morty altered Rick's relationship to his own significance, forced him into contact with the question of what his intelligence means when it's not cosmologically guaranteed, removed the constructed certainty, and left the raw question, who is Rick without the curve? What is his intelligence worth in an infinite multiverse where he's not the organizing principle? Rick Prime altered Rick's relationship to his own grief. Not by resolving it. Nothing about the Rick Prime arc resolves the grief, but by externalizing it. By giving the wound a face and a history and a set of specific actions that Rick can finally locate rather than simply live inside of. The grief becomes, after Rick Prime, something slightly more knowable. Not smaller, not easier, but slightly less formless. Both alterations are real. Both are permanent. Both ripple forward through every subsequent scene, shaping Rick's choices and his emotional landscape and his relationships in ways that the audience can feel even when they can't precisely articulate them. That's the work a well-built villain does. Not just in the climactic confrontation, but in everything that follows. In the changed person, moving through a story that now exists in the aftermath of something real. Here's something the show understands that most stories don't. Change in a character doesn't always look like growth. The conventional narrative arc wants change to be progress. The hero changes through their encounter with the villain, and the change makes them stronger, wiser, more capable, better suited to the challenges ahead. The trauma is processed and transformed into something useful. The wound heals into something that strengthens. Real change doesn't always work that way. Sometimes change is just different. Sometimes what you carry forward from a significant encounter is not a better version of yourself, but a version of yourself with something added that doesn't make you better or worse, just changed. More complex, carrying more. Rick doesn't become better through his encounters with Evil Morty and Rick Prime. He becomes more fully himself, more clearly who he was always going to be, more openly carrying what he was always privately carrying. The encounters strip away some of the protective layers, force some things into the open that Rick would have preferred to keep hidden, demand a kind of honesty, with himself, if not with anyone else, that his elaborate defenses had been designed to prevent. That's not growth in the conventional sense. But it's real change, and it's more honest than the kind of change that turns adversity into triumph, that metabolizes loss into strength, that makes the wound a teacher whose lessons are clearly good. Rick's wounds are not clearly good. His grief is not a blessing in disguise. The changes his antagonists have worked in him are real and permanent, and not obviously for the better. And the show tells that truth, without softening it, without reaching for the reassuring arc where suffering produces wisdom and villains are ultimately gifts. They're not gifts, they're losses. And Rick carries them as losses, honestly, without the consolation of having been improved by them. That honesty is why the changes feel real, and why the villains who created them feel real, and why all of it persists long after the episodes end. Let's close this chapter with the question the test at its beginning points toward. Remove Evil Morty from the story. Is Rick the same person? No. He's a Rick who never had to confront what the curve represented, who never had to look at a Morty who decided the relationship wasn't worth the cost, who never had to sit with the question of what his intelligence means in an actually infinite multiverse, who lost none of what Evil Morty's success cost him. That Rick is less fully realized, less honestly seen, less in contact with the questions about his own existence that matter most. Remove Rick Prime from the story. Is Rick the same person? No. He's a Rick without a wound at his center, without the loss that shaped everything, without the grief that, in a terrible and irreversible way, preserved his humanity by demanding he feel something enormous and real. He's a Rick who might be more capable, more optimized, more fully in control of his extraordinary intelligence. He might, in other words, be something closer to Rick Prime. And that's the final thing worth saying about what the show's greatest villains did to its greatest protagonist. They kept him human, not by healing him, Not by making him better, but by costing him things that mattered, things that had to matter for the cost to be real. And in the costing, in the specific weight of the specific losses, in the changes that didn't resolve into growth but simply remained as changes, in all of that, something genuine survived. Something that intelligence without love could never produce. Something worth calling a person. Chapter 8. Fear without overusing the villain. There's a paradox at the heart of how great antagonists work in long-form storytelling. The more you show a villain, the less frightening they become. This isn't always true in the short term. A villain who appears frequently and consistently demonstrates their capability can maintain a surface-level threat. You know they're dangerous. You've seen the evidence. The threat is real and documented. But something more subtle erodes with each appearance. Each time a villain is shown, they become slightly more familiar, slightly more categorized, slightly more of a known quantity in the audience's mental filing system. The first time you see a shadow moving at the edge of a dark room, your heart rate spikes. The 10th time you see the same shadow, you've learned its patterns. You know what it is. The familiarity doesn't eliminate the danger, but it eliminates the specific fear that comes from not knowing. The specific fear from not knowing is the most powerful fear in storytelling. It's the fear that lives in the imagination, which is always more vivid than the depiction. It's the fear that the audience generates themselves, by filling the unknown space with whatever their own minds find most threatening. A villain shown constantly is a villain whose worst possibilities have been mapped. A villain shown rarely is a villain whose worst possibilities remain open. Potentially larger, potentially more frightening, potentially capable of things the story hasn't yet demonstrated because the story hasn't yet shown you enough to rule them out. Rick and Morty understood this with Evil Morty from the beginning. And the management of his presence, the careful, disciplined rationing of his appearances, is one of the most sophisticated exercises in villain economy in animated television. Let's count the appearances. Evil Morty appears, fully revealed as himself, across a handful of moments across the series. The first introduction, the eye patch removed, the yellow eye, the controlled expression, takes seconds. His next significant appearance is the Citadel election arc in Season 3, where he's present for more extended time but still contained within a single episode. His full arc resolution comes in Season 5. Across the show's entire run, Evil Morty's cumulative screen time as himself, not as a Morty, not as a disguised presence, but as the identified character, is minimal. Remarkably minimal for someone who occupies such a large space in the show's mythology and in the audience's imagination. That disproportion, the gap between how little screen time he has and how much space he occupies, is not an accident. It's the entire point. Every second of Evil Morty's presence is load-bearing. Nothing is filler, nothing is repetition. Nothing appears because the writers needed to remind the audience he exists, or because they wanted to give him more to do, or because they had an interesting scene for him that didn't advance his essential function in the story. He appears when what he represents is necessary. And he disappears when what he represents has been sufficiently established, trusting the audience to maintain the weight of it without needing constant reinforcement. That trust is the discipline. And discipline, in villain management, is what separates the antagonists who haunt you from the antagonists who become furniture. Think about what happens to a villain who appears too frequently. The first problem is familiarity. As noted, the erosion of mystery that comes from too much exposure. But there's a second problem that's equally significant and less often discussed. Overexposure creates expectation patterns. When a villain appears regularly, the audience learns the rhythm. They know roughly when the villain will show up, roughly what kind of scene to expect, roughly what the encounter will look like. The villain becomes, in a structural sense, predictable. Not necessarily in terms of specific plot mechanics, but in terms of the emotional shape of the appearance. And predictability is the death of dread. Dread, the particular emotional quality that great villains generate, the sense of something approaching that you can't fully prepare for, requires uncertainty about timing. You can't dread something that arrives on schedule. You can anticipate it, you can prepare for it, but the specific quality of dread comes from not knowing when or exactly how. Evil Morty's appearances are unpredictable in exactly this way. Not random, each appearance is carefully positioned within the show's larger narrative structure. But from the audience's perspective, from inside the experience of watching, they arrive without warning. Episodes go by, seasons pass, and then suddenly he's there again, and the quality of his return carries a shock that wouldn't be possible if he'd been a regular presence. That shock refreshes the dread. Each appearance reestablishes him as a genuine threat rather than a familiar antagonist. He never becomes furniture because he never stays long enough to become background. There's a specific scene in the Tales from the Citadel episode that demonstrates the scarcity principle with particular clarity. Evil Morty's campaign for Citadel president is the episode's central political plotline, but it's threaded through stories following other characters. Working-class Ricks, a Morty in crisis, the everyday bureaucratic functioning of the Citadel society. Evil Morty doesn't dominate the episode. He appears in intervals, between scenes that have nothing to do with him. This structure does something interesting, because the audience knows who Evil Morty is, has been thinking about him since the Season 1 reveal. His appearances within the episode carry a weight that the surrounding scenes, which feature characters we're meeting for the first time, can't match. He becomes the magnetic pole of the episode's attention even though he's physically present for less of its runtime than many other characters. The scarcity creates magnetic force. Every moment he appears, it matters. Every word he speaks carries the weight of everything that came before. The audience leans in when he's on screen in a way they don't lean in for characters they've seen more of, simply because the relative rarity signals that what's being shown is important. This is counterintuitive if you think of screen time as the primary way to establish importance. More screen time should equal more weight, more significance, more emotional investment. But weight doesn't work that way. What creates weight is not quantity but concentration. A small amount of something very dense is heavier than a large amount of something diffuse. Evil Morty's appearances are dense, packed with significance, free of anything that dilutes that significance, and the density is maintained by the scarcity. If he appeared more often, the density would necessarily decrease. You'd need filler scenes, transitional moments, episodes where he exists but nothing essential happens. Scarcity keeps every appearance essential. Rick Prime's relationship to scarcity works differently, and understanding the difference illuminates two distinct strategies for managing villain presence. Evil Morty is scarce in his on-screen appearances, but increasingly present in the narrative's structural attention. The Citadel, the central finite curve, the larger architecture of the show's mythology keeps pointing at him even when he's not visible. Rick Prime is scarce in a different way. He's not primarily a structural presence, he's a personal one. His scarcity is felt most keenly in Rick's interior life, in the shape of the grief that organizes Rick's character, in the absence that the wound created and that everything since has been organized around. Before Rick Prime is fully revealed as a character, he exists in the show as pure negative space. He's the thing that explains Rick without being present to explain it. He's the reason without a face, the cause without a presence. This is a genuinely unusual form of villain construction. Most antagonists are established through presence. You see them, you understand what they do, you feel their threat directly. Rick Prime is established through absence. You understand what he did, you feel the consequences of it in the person he damaged, and the specific horror of him accumulates through that secondhand evidence long before you see him directly. By the time Rick Prime is fully confronted as a character, the audience has been living with the evidence of him for seasons. The grief he created has been the substrate of one of the show's most important characters throughout the entire run. You know what he cost without knowing who he is. When you finally see who he is, you're not starting from zero. You're finishing a picture you've been assembling for years. Let's think about the relationship between mystery and fear, because they're connected in ways that become visible when you examine how scarcity functions. Fear in fiction operates on two levels simultaneously. There's the object-level fear, the specific threat, the depicted danger, the thing the character is in danger from. And there's the ambient fear, the background emotional quality that the story maintains, the sense that danger is possible even when nothing threatening is immediately present. Object-level fear requires the threatening thing to be present. The monster has to be on screen for you to fear the monster. Ambient fear requires only the possibility of presence. The monster doesn't have to be in the room. The knowledge that it exists, that it could appear, that the safety of any given moment is provisional, that's enough. Ambient fear is more powerful and more durable than object-level fear. It doesn't dissipate when the scene ends. It doesn't require constant stimulation. It's a background state that persists, coloring how you experience everything else in the story, creating a quality of alertness and unease that the story can draw on without having to generate it fresh each time. Evil Morty's scarcity creates ambient fear, because he could appear at any point, because the show has demonstrated that his appearances arrive without warning, because the intelligence and patience he demonstrated in his first appearance suggest a capability that hasn't been fully revealed. A depth of planning that might be operating even when he's not visible. That ambient fear is more frightening than any specific demonstration of threat. It's more frightening because it doesn't have edges. You can't assess it. You can't prepare for it. You can only live with the knowledge that it's there, somewhere, doing whatever it's doing. There's a concept in horror filmmaking called the less you show, the scarier it is. The idea that suggesting threat is more frightening than depicting it. The monster glimpsed at the edge of frame is more frightening than the monster seen clearly in full light. This concept applies to villain design in ways that go beyond horror. Any antagonist benefits from being partially revealed rather than fully shown. Any threat becomes more threatening when its full extent remains unknown. Rick and Morty applies this principle consistently across its treatment of Evil Morty. But it does something more sophisticated than simply withholding visual information. It withholds motivational information. You see Evil Morty. You see what he does. You understand the broad strokes of what he wants. But you don't fully understand why. You don't have access to the specific interior life, the specific wound, the specific reasoning that connects the person to the project. That motivational mystery is more disorienting than visual mystery because it operates at a deeper level. A monster you can't fully see might be physically frightening. An antagonist whose inner life you can't fully access is philosophically frightening, because you can't predict them. Because your normal tools for understanding people, reading motivation, tracing causation, modeling the decision process, don't fully work. Evil Morty's motivational opacity keeps him dangerous in a way that a fully explained villain never is. Because you can't fully model what he'd do next. Because the edges of his psychology remain just out of clear sight. And that impossibility of full modeling is itself a form of threat. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Does overuse of a villain only affect how frightening they are, or does it affect something deeper? It affects something deeper. Overuse doesn't just erode fear, it erodes meaning. A villain who appears constantly eventually starts to feel like part of the furniture of the story's world. Something that's simply there, a regular feature of the landscape, rather than something exceptional. And exceptional is what a great villain needs to be. Not just in capability, but in significance. In the sense that their existence in the story is remarkable, that their presence carries weight, that they represent something that doesn't simply exist in the background of every episode. The meaning of a villain is tied to their rarity. When they appear, it matters, because the appearance is unusual. When they don't appear, they remain significant because their absence is notable. Because you notice they're not there. Because their not being there is a fact about the episode rather than simply the absence of a regular feature. Evil Morty's meaning, as a philosophical counterpoint to Rick, as a structural disruption to the show's mythology, as a Morty who decided differently, is maintained by his scarcity in exactly this way. When he appears, the episode is about something larger than its surface concern. When he doesn't appear, you're still aware of the space where he could be. That's a villain who has become part of the story's meaning rather than just part of its plot. The contrast with how most villains are handled is worth making explicit. In most serialized animated storytelling, the primary antagonist is a near-constant presence. They appear in most episodes. They're the engine of the season's conflict. Their goals and their opposition to the hero are the through line that holds the season together. This structure is narratively logical. If the villain is the main source of conflict, they need to be consistently present to maintain the conflict. The plot requires them, and so they appear, episode after episode, until by the end of the season the audience has spent more time with the villain than with almost any other character. And by the end of the season, the villain is often the least frightening they've ever been. Because familiarity. Because the audience has seen every mood, every tactic, every emotional register the villain occupies. Because the villain has become as known as any other character in the show, and known characters aren't frightening in the way that unknown ones are. Evil Morty never reaches this saturation. He never becomes a known quantity in the way that a constantly present villain does. Even by the end of his arc, even when you understand what he wanted, and what he did to achieve it, there's still a quality of the unknowable about him, a depth that wasn't fully plumbed, a question that wasn't fully answered. And that quality persists beyond the arc because it was never resolved. The mystery he maintained through his scarcity outlasts the story that contained him. There's a specific emotional mechanism that scarcity exploits, and it's worth naming directly. The mechanism is anticipation. Anticipation is distinct from both fear and excitement, though it carries elements of both. It's the state of holding something in mind as approaching, something significant, something that will change the current situation, something that matters in a way that the ordinary flow of events doesn't. When a villain is scarce, anticipation can build between appearances. The audience knows the villain exists. They know they'll appear again, they don't know when. And the not knowing when creates anticipation that accumulates, episode by episode, until the appearance finally comes. By the time Evil Morty appears in Tales from the Citadel, the anticipation that has been building since Season 1 has had substantial time to accumulate. The appearance releases that anticipation, partially. It gives you some of what you were waiting for. But because Evil Morty's appearances are always partial, never fully explanatory, always leaving more unknown than known, the anticipation doesn't fully discharge. It just reorients, finds new questions to accumulate around. This management of anticipation, building it, partially releasing it, building it again from a new position, is what gives Evil Morty's arc its particular quality of momentum without resolution. You're always waiting for the next piece, and the pieces always satisfy enough to make you want more, and the wanting never quite catches up to the having. Let's talk about what happens in the specific moments of Evil Morty's appearances to generate maximum impact from minimum presence. The eye patch scene. A few seconds. The reveal is wordless. There's no speech, no explanation, no announcement of intent. A mask is removed and a face is shown, and what's on the face is control, not triumph, not rage, not any of the emotional states that typically accompany a villain reveal. Just control. The calm of someone who has been operating under perfect discipline for a long time and is simply continuing to do so. That wordlessness is doing enormous work. A speech would have given you something to analyze, something to quote, something to argue with. The silence gives you nothing to grab onto. You're left with the image and the implication and your own imagination doing the work of filling in what it means. The campaign speech at the Citadel. Evil Morty speaks, but not about himself. He speaks about the system, about the people the system has failed, about the accurate analysis of the Citadel's corruption. The speech is not a villain monologue. It's a political address that happens to be delivered by someone you know has an agenda beyond what he's saying. The gap between the accurate content of the speech and your knowledge of the speaker creates a particular discomfort, a recognition that truth can be used instrumentally, that correctness is not the same as sincerity, that someone can say genuinely right things for reasons that are not right. The portal exit. Evil Morty steps through and is gone. No final speech, no lingering farewell, no moment of addressing Rick directly. He achieves what he achieved and then he leaves. Without the narrative beat that most stories would provide, the confrontation, the acknowledgement, the exchange that would give both characters and audience a form of closure. The closure is withheld, and the withholding of closure is, paradoxically, what gives the ending its weight. The absence of a final confrontation between Rick and Evil Morty deserves its own extended consideration, because it's one of the most deliberately unsatisfying moments in the show's history. Most narratives build toward the confrontation between protagonist and antagonist. The confrontation is the release valve for the tension that's been accumulating. It's where things are said that needed saying, where the conflict finds its resolution, where both characters are changed by direct engagement with each other. Rick and Evil Morty never fully have this scene. They've been in proximity. There's awareness between them, but the direct confrontation, the conversation, the reckoning, the moment where Rick and Evil Morty look at each other and say what there is to say, doesn't happen. Evil Morty completes his plan and leaves without that scene. And Rick is left to process what happened, without the closure that the scene would have provided. This is uncomfortable, narratively uncomfortable, because the story has built the expectation, slowly, carefully, across seasons, that the confrontation is coming. And then it doesn't come, or doesn't come in the form you expected. And you're left holding the anticipation that was supposed to discharge into the confrontation, but didn't. That held anticipation is itself a form of meaning. because it mirrors something true about the experience of people who shaped you deeply, never having to account for what they did. Evil Morty changed the shape of Rick's universe without ever being required to sit across from Rick and have the conversation. He completed his project and left, and Rick, like anyone who's ever been significantly affected by someone who then simply moved on, has to carry that without the resolution. The scarcity of their direct engagement is, finally, one of the most honest things about the relationship. Not everything that matters gets resolved. Not every significant encounter comes with the confrontation that would make sense of it. Some things just happen, and then you carry them. Here's what the scarcity principle ultimately teaches about villain construction, stated plainly. The goal of a villain is not to fill the story. The goal of a villain is to haunt it. Filling the story is a function of quantity. Haunting is a function of quality, of impact, of significance, of the specific weight that certain moments carry when the accumulation of restraint finally releases. Evil Morty haunts the show in a way that a constantly present villain never could. Because hauntings require absence. A ghost that's always visible stops being frightening and starts being a feature of the landscape. A ghost that appears rarely, that seems to operate according to its own logic rather than the schedule of the story, that disappears before you've fully processed its presence, that kind of ghost persists. That kind of ghost follows you home. The discipline required to maintain this is real and significant. It means resisting the natural impulse to use a compelling character more. It means trusting that what's been established will hold without constant reinforcement. It means accepting that the villain's greatest power is exercised not on screen, but in the audience's imagination, and that anything you put on screen risks diminishing what the imagination has built. Rick and Morty trusted this. It exercised the discipline. And Evil Morty, as a result, occupies a space in the show's mythology that is entirely disproportionate to his screen time. An enormous presence built from minimal appearances, maintained by patience and restraint, and the conviction that less, applied with precision, creates more. There's one more dimension of the scarcity principle worth exploring before we move on. Scarcity of appearance is not the same as scarcity of influence. Evil Morty doesn't appear very often, but his influence, on the Citadel, on Rick's understanding of his own mythology, on the structural architecture of the multiverse itself, is enormous and cumulative. Between appearances, things happen that he set in motion. Consequences of his earlier actions ripple through events he's not personally present for. The world continues to be shaped by his intelligence and his planning even in his absence. This creates a quality of omnipresence that accompanies the physical scarcity. He's rarely on screen, but he's always operating. Always somewhere in the background of events, continuing the project, managing the system he built, working toward the goal that will eventually require him to be visible again. That combination, physical scarcity and narrative omnipresence, is the ideal configuration for a long-form antagonist. You're aware that something is happening even when you can't see it. You know that the absence of direct evidence is not absence of activity. You hold the villain in your attention as an active presence even during the stretches where they're not on screen. And when they finally do appear, when the omnipresent operating intelligence becomes suddenly physically visible, the appearance carries the weight of everything that was happening during the absence. All the accumulated operating, all the preparation, all the moves that were being made while you weren't watching. Evil Morty's appearances feel enormous partly for this reason, because each one arrives with the sense that it represents the surface of something much larger that's been running underneath. The iceberg of a great villain, the small visible portion that suggests the vast, cold, invisible mass beneath. And the vast mass beneath is what you're really afraid of. Not what you've seen, what you know is there. Chapter 9. What other stories can learn? There's a question that emerges naturally from everything we've explored so far, and it's a question worth asking directly before this documentary reaches its conclusion. Why does any of this matter beyond Rick and Morty? Not in the dismissive sense, not as a way of suggesting that analyzing an animated series is somehow insufficient, but in the genuine sense. What does the specific craft that went into building Evil Morty and Rick Prime and the philosophical architecture of their antagonism teach us about storytelling more broadly? What principles survive the removal from their specific context and remain useful when applied to entirely different kinds of stories? Because the techniques we've been examining aren't specific to science fiction, or to animation, or to adult animated comedies with surprisingly sophisticated narrative structures. They're techniques for building human truth into fictional form. And human truth, assembled correctly, works in any container you put it in. That's what this chapter is about. Not a list of other shows that do or don't measure up to Rick and Morty's standard. Not a ranking of animated series by villain quality. But a genuine examination of what the principles at work in this specific show reveal about how antagonism functions in storytelling at the broadest level, and what most long-form narratives get consistently wrong that Rick and Morty, at its best, gets consistently right. The first and most fundamental lesson is the one that runs through every chapter of this documentary, stated now with the directness it deserves. Villains are not obstacles. They are arguments. Most storytelling treats antagonists as problems to be solved. The hero has a goal. The villain prevents the hero from achieving the goal. The story is about the process of overcoming that prevention. The villain exists to make the hero's journey difficult. This is a functional structure. It generates plots. It creates tension. It gives heroes something to do. But it produces antagonists who disappear the moment they're defeated. Because the obstacle is gone, the problem is solved. There's nothing left of the villain except what the hero did to overcome them. And even that fades as the story moves to new problems. Rick and Morty's greatest villains don't function this way. They're not problems to be solved. They're positions to be engaged with, worldviews to be argued against, philosophies that generate discomfort not just in the hero, but in the audience, because the philosophies are coherent enough to demand response. Evil Morty's argument that any system built to center one person's significance at the expense of everyone else's autonomy is fundamentally illegitimate, is not defeated when Evil Morty escapes. It survives him. It persists because it's true, or partly true, or true enough that you can't dismiss it just because the character holding it is gone. Rick Prime's argument that the most honest response to an indifferent universe is to optimize without the friction of caring about other people is not defeated when Rick Prime is confronted. It survives because it's coherent, because the logic holds even if the conclusion is horrifying, because you can't make it go away by winning a fight against the person articulating it. Arguments don't die when their proponents do. That's the principle. And the practical implication for storytelling is, if you want a villain who persists, give them an argument, not just a motivation. The second lesson is about the relationship between understanding and sympathy, because they're often confused, and the confusion is damaging to villain construction. Most storytelling advice about creating memorable villains involves some version of make them sympathetic, give them a relatable motivation, show that they were hurt before they became the thing they are, let the audience feel sorry for them, and the villain will feel real. This advice isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. And when it's taken as the whole of the answer, it produces a particular failure mode. The villain who is understandable but not compelling. Who generates pity rather than engagement. Who is explained in ways that make them smaller rather than larger. Rick and Morty separates understanding from sympathy in a way that's crucial. Evil Morty is understandable. His desire for freedom from a system that was built to make him small is entirely understandable. But the show doesn't ask you to feel sorry for him. It asks you to understand him, his logic, his analysis, his strategy, and to engage with what he's doing from a position of comprehension rather than pity. Rick Prime is understandable in his own cold way. His philosophy is internally coherent. You can follow the reasoning. But the show isn't trying to make you sympathize with him. It's trying to make you see him clearly, which is a different and more demanding thing. Understanding without sympathy is what makes these characters feel like genuine intellectual and moral presences rather than victims who became villains. They're not asking for your forgiveness. They're not performing a wound that explains them away. They exist as positions, as people who see the world a particular way and act accordingly. And the engagement they demand is the engagement of argument, not the engagement of compassion. That's harder to achieve than sympathy, and it produces something more interesting. The third lesson concerns the relationship between plot and character in villain construction, because it's where most long-form storytelling makes its most consequential errors. The standard approach to building a long-form villain involves establishing their plan and then executing it across the season. The villain has a goal. The steps toward that goal are the plot. The villain's characterization emerges through their pursuit of the plot. This produces plot-driven villains. And plot-driven villains are only as interesting as their plot. When the plot is clever, the villain seems clever. When the plot has weaknesses, the villain seems limited. The villain is as large or as small as the specific scheme that contains them. Once the scheme is resolved, defeated, or succeeded, the villain has nowhere left to go. They were the scheme. Without the scheme, they're nothing. Rick and Morty's best villains have plots, but the plots are not the villains. Evil Morty's scheme, the long, patient arc of manipulation and positioning that eventually destroys the central finite curve, is a vehicle for his philosophy, not the whole of his character. If the scheme had been different, if he'd found a different path to the same goal, he would still be Evil Morty. The philosophy that drives the scheme is what he is. The scheme is just what the philosophy looked like in action. This distinction matters enormously for how the villain survives beyond the plot, because a character who exists independently of their plot can persist after the plot ends. Evil Morty, without his Citadel scheme, is still a coherent person with a coherent worldview. He's not the scheme. The scheme was just the thing he was doing when we saw him. That independence, character independent of plot, is what allows a villain to be remembered after the story ends, because the story was never the whole of them. The fourth lesson is about patience, and it's the one that most contradicts the pressures of contemporary serialized storytelling. The business logic of long-form serialized narrative pushes against patience at every level. Audiences can disengage. Streaming platforms want event moments that drive conversation. Writers' rooms are under pressure to make things happen, to keep the story moving, to give viewers reasons to keep watching. All of that pressure is real, and none of it is compatible with the kind of patience that makes Evil Morty what he is. Evil Morty's construction required years, literal years of maintenance, of keeping the mystery open, of resisting the pressure to explain, of trusting that the audience's imagination was doing more interesting work than any explanation could. It required the confidence to let seasons go by without resolving questions that audiences were actively asking. Most storytelling doesn't have that confidence. It fills the silence. It answers the questions. It provides the explanation that ties things up and moves the story forward. Because moving forward is what stories are supposed to do. Rick and Morty, at its best, holds its ground against that pressure. It lets things develop at the pace their development requires. It trusts that withholding is sometimes more powerful than delivering. It maintains its mysteries not through incompetence or neglect, but through deliberate restraint. The lesson for storytelling broadly is not just that patience is valuable. That's obvious. The lesson is about what patience requires, the institutional confidence to resist the pressure toward resolution, and the structural commitment to ensuring that what's being held in mystery is genuinely worth holding. If you're going to make your audience wait, what you deliver when the wait ends has to justify the wait. Rick and Morty earns its patience by consistently delivering reveals that expand rather than contract, that generate new questions rather than simply closing old ones, that make the world of the story larger and more interesting rather than smaller and more resolved. That's the standard, and it's a high one. The fifth lesson is about what it means for a villain to change the hero, and why most long-form narratives fail this test without realizing they've failed it. The failure mode is what might be called the reset problem. A villain appears. They threaten the hero. The hero struggles. The hero eventually overcomes. The villain is defeated, and the hero returns, more or less, to who they were before the conflict. Slightly wiser, perhaps. Slightly more capable. But fundamentally the same person, moving forward in the same direction with the same essential values and the same essential relationships. The conflict happened. It didn't change anything permanent. This reset is often not a deliberate choice. It's the result of the competing demands of serialized storytelling. Heroes need to be consistent enough to remain recognizable across many episodes and seasons. Character change that's too drastic can feel like a betrayal of the character the audience has come to know. And so the changes get softened, qualified, eventually absorbed back into the baseline. Rick and Morty doesn't fully escape this pressure either. Rick is recognizably Rick across the entire series. The show's comedic identity requires a degree of consistency, but within that constraint, the changes that Evil Morty and Rick Prime have worked on Rick are genuinely there and genuinely permanent. Rick's relationship to his own mythology, to what his intelligence means, to how the Citadel defined his significance, to the constructed nature of the universe he's been moving through, is different after Evil Morty. Rick's relationship to his grief, to what it is, where it comes from, what face it has, is different after Rick Prime. The changes are subtle. They accumulate across many scenes rather than resolving into a single transformative moment. But they're real. And they're permanent in the specific sense that the show doesn't undo them, doesn't have Rick return to who he was, carries the changes forward. That accumulative, permanent, subtle change is what genuine villain impact looks like. Not a dramatic transformation that announces itself. A quiet, persistent alteration in how the hero sees the world and moves through it. Most stories opt for the dramatic transformation and then quietly reset it. Rick and Morty opts for the quiet alteration and then actually keeps it. The sixth lesson is about the difference between a villain's function in the story and a villain's function for the audience. These are related but distinct. A villain's function in the story is what they do to the plot, to the hero, to the world of the narrative. A villain's function for the audience is what they do to the people watching, what questions they raise, what feelings they generate, what ideas they put in motion. Most storytelling analysis focuses on the first function. How does the villain drive the plot? How do they challenge the hero? What narrative purpose do they serve? Rick and Morty's greatest villains are built primarily around the second function. Evil Morty's narrative function, disrupting the citadel, escaping the curve, is less important than what he does for the audience. Raises genuine questions about freedom and systems and the legitimacy of constructed hierarchies. Rick Prime's narrative function, explaining Rick's grief, providing an enemy for Rick to pursue, is less important than what he does for the audience, makes the specific shape of formative loss visible in a way that resonates with people who've experienced their own versions of it. When you build villains for their narrative function, they're as interesting as the plot that needs them. When you build them for their audience function, for the questions they raise, the feelings they generate, the ideas they put in motion, they transcend the plot entirely. They persist after the story ends, because what they did to the audience doesn't end when the credits roll. The question to ask when building an antagonist is not only, what do they do to the story, but what do they do to the person watching? If you can answer the second question with something real, something that connects to actual human experience, actual fears, actual philosophical questions, you've built something worth remembering. The seventh lesson is about the specific way Rick and Morty handles the relationship between villain intelligence and villain threat. The conventional wisdom is that making a villain smarter makes them more threatening. More intelligence means better plans, better adaptation, more complete control of their situation. The smart villain is more dangerous than the dumb one. Rick and Morty interrogates this by making most of its significant antagonists exceptionally intelligent, and then locating the true source of their threat somewhere other than the intelligence. Evil Morty is threatening not because he's smart, but because he's committed. His intelligence is the vehicle for a commitment. To freedom, to escape, to the destruction of the system that would have found a way to express itself regardless of its specific vehicle. A less intelligent Evil Morty might have found a slower or clumsier path to the same destination. The destination was always the point. Rick Prime is threatening not because he's smart, but because he's empty. His intelligence is unencumbered by the friction of caring about anything beyond itself, and the unencumbered intelligence produces something that functions like malevolence without being motivated by it. He's not trying to harm anyone. The harm is incidental. And incidental harm is somehow more frightening than deliberate harm, because it can't be predicted or appealed to or redirected. The threat in both cases is located not in the intelligence, but in what the intelligence is in service of. Or in the case of Rick Prime, what the intelligence lacks that would make it oriented towards something beyond itself. The practical lesson: intelligence makes a villain more capable. But capability isn't threat. What the villain is capable of doing, and why, and what they'd be willing to do, that's where the threat lives. Build from there. Intelligence is just the amplifier. The eighth lesson is about economy of means, and it might be the most teachable of everything we've explored. Economy of means is the principle that the best storytelling achieves the most with the least, that every element should be doing as much work as possible, that what's not there is as important as what is. Rick and Morty exercises economy of means with its greatest antagonists in ways that are almost invisible until you start counting. The introduction of Evil Morty, a single image, a few seconds. Everything that needed to be established: existence, capability, intelligence, patience, threat, established without a line of dialogue directed at the camera, without an explanation, without a scene that says, here is a new villain, here is what they can do, here is why you should care. The management of Rick Prime across the early seasons. An absence that accumulates meaning. a negative space whose shape becomes increasingly legible the longer it persists. All the information about Rick that the absence implies, delivered without a scene, without an episode, without any direct presentation of the thing itself. The central finite curve reveal, a concept that reframes everything the audience has seen, that changes the meaning of years of storytelling, delivered in the context of a scene that's doing several other things simultaneously. No dedicated episode, no special two-parter. Just, here is the thing, here is what it means, and now the story continues. Economy of means requires confidence. The confidence that the audience is paying close enough attention to catch things that aren't announced. That the implication is sufficient without the explication. That the frame can be shifted without stopping to describe the shift. Most storytelling explains too much. Rick and Morty, at its best, trusts the audience to do the work of understanding, and in doing so, makes the audience participants in the story rather than simply recipients of it. The ninth lesson is one that emerges only when you look at the full arc of the show's villain construction, across multiple seasons with some distance. The lesson is about accumulation. Individual episodes, individual scenes, individual villain moments. These are the atoms. But the thing that makes Rick and Morty's antagonists genuinely extraordinary is not any single atom. It's the molecule, the structure that the atoms form across time, the meaning that emerges from the accumulation rather than from any individual moment. Evil Morty's power is not located in any single episode. It's located in the relationship between episodes, in the gaps and the returns and the ways each appearance resonates differently because of everything that came before it. The eye patch scene lands differently after the Citadel election arc. The Citadel election arc lands differently after the central finite curve reveal. Each piece changes the meaning of the pieces that came before it while being changed by them simultaneously. This is what genuine long-form storytelling can do that shorter forms can't. Build meaning through accumulation. Create significance that's distributed across time rather than concentrated in a single event. Make the structure itself the thing, not just the moments within the structure. Most long-form storytelling doesn't actually use this capacity. It produces a series of largely self-contained episodes or arcs that happen to feature the same characters, without the deep accumulative structure that makes each piece meaningful, partly through its relationship to every other piece. Rick and Morty's greatest villains are built into the deep structure of the show in a way that makes their individual appearances meaningful at the molecular level, meaningful through relationship and accumulation, rather than just the atomic level. That's the standard for what long-form storytelling could be. And most of it, even the best of it, hasn't fully reached that standard. The 10th lesson is the most fundamental, and the one that all the others emerge from. Great villains are built from truth. Not from clever plotting, not from interesting visual design, not from impressive power sets or memorable catchphrases or any of the surface features that people typically point to when they discuss why a villain worked. From truth, from something genuinely real about human experience, about what people want, about what they fear, about what they believe, about what wounds do to people, and what people do with their wounds. Evil Morty is built from the truth of what it feels like to be instrumentalized, to exist in a system that was built for someone else, to look clearly at the structure of your situation and understand exactly how it was designed to limit you, and to want, with everything you have, to be somewhere outside it. That truth is not science fictional. It's not specific to animated characters in an infinite multiverse. It's recognizable to anyone who has ever understood the systems they were born into clearly enough to want out. Rick Prime is built from the truth of indifference as a form of damage, of what it means to be hurt by someone who didn't care enough to know they were hurting you, of the specific impossibility of seeking reckoning from someone who doesn't recognize what they did as requiring reckoning. That truth is not about intergalactic travel or alternate universe Ricks. It's about what certain kinds of loss feel like and why they're so hard to metabolize. Rick C-137 is built from the truth of loving people more than you want to admit, in a world that keeps demonstrating why loving people is dangerous, of using intelligence as a defense mechanism, of the specific pain of being unable to be what your own philosophy requires you to be, because you can't stop caring even when you know the care makes you vulnerable. These truths are what the audience connects to, not the science fiction, not the multiverse, not the animation or the humor or the specific narrative structure of any given episode, the truth underneath it all. Here is what other stories can learn from Rick and Morty's approach to antagonism, stated as directly as possible. A villain should believe something, not just want something. The belief should be coherent enough to argue with, and specific enough to generate consequences. The story should take the belief seriously, rather than dismissing it through the villain's defeat. A villain should be scarce enough that their presence carries weight. The imagination is always more powerful than the depiction. Trust it. Resist the pressure to explain and overexpose. A villain should change the hero in ways that are permanent. Not dramatically, not in a single transformative scene. Quietly, cumulatively, in ways that are visible across many subsequent scenes as a persistent alteration in how the hero sees the world. A villain should function for the audience, not just for the plot. They should raise questions that persist after the story ends. They should connect to human truths that survive their specific narrative context. A villain should be built from the inside out, not from their plan, not from their powers, not from their visual design, but from their worldview, their wound, their specific way of seeing what the universe is and what it demands. And a villain should be respected by the story that contains them, not endorsed, not sympathized with beyond what's honest, but respected, taken seriously, given real capability, allowed to make real arguments, permitted to win when their winning is what the story honestly requires. That respect is what Rick and Morty extends to its greatest antagonists. And the audience, feeling that respect, extends their own investment in return. Because we always know when a story is taking something seriously, and we always respond to seriousness with seriousness of our own. There's one last thing worth saying in this chapter, before the documentary reaches its conclusion. Everything explored here, the philosophy, the patience, the mystery, the accumulation, the truth, these aren't techniques that require a science fiction setting or an animated format or any of the specific features that make Rick and Morty what it is. They require something simpler and harder. They require a storyteller who takes their audience seriously, who believes that the people watching are capable of sitting with complexity, with uncertainty, with questions that don't resolve, who trusts that the unspoken can be as powerful as the spoken. Who is willing to withhold the explanation that would make things easier in order to preserve the mystery that makes things true? Rick and Morty, at its best, is that storyteller, and its greatest villains are proof of what becomes possible when a story trusts the people receiving it enough to give them something genuinely demanding. Demanding to sit with, demanding to argue with, demanding to carry. The best antagonists are always a form of demand, and the stories that produce them are always, underneath the plot and the character and the clever craft, asking something real of the people who encounter them. That's what Rick and Morty asks. And that's why, long after the episodes end, the asking doesn't stop. Chapter 10. The Secret Behind the Perfect Villain. We've spent 9 chapters circling something, not avoiding it, circling it. The way you circle something that requires approach from multiple angles before the full shape becomes visible. The way understanding accumulates rather than arrives. The way certain truths are only available after you've done enough work to deserve them. Now we're here, at the end of the examination, with everything we've gathered laid out around us. The philosophy, the patience, the mystery, the scarcity, the permanent changes worked in the hero, the truths underneath the science fiction and the animation and the humor and the specific texture of a show that is, somehow, both deeply silly and genuinely profound. All of it in service of one question: why do audiences remember these villains years later? Not because they were powerful. We've established that. Not because they were powerful. We've established that. Not because they were powerful. Not because they were powerful. Not because they were powerful. We've established that make impressive introductions, or clever schemes, or any of the surface features that make antagonists initially interesting. Something deeper. Something that survived the plot, survived the episodes, survived the distance of years. Something that's still operating in the minds of people who watched this show years ago and haven't thought about it consciously in months, but who, if you asked them right now, could reconstruct the yellow eye and the controlled expression and the feeling of watching the eye patch come off, and feel something real in the reconstruction. Why? Let's start with what memory actually does to fictional characters. When something is genuinely remembered, not just recognized when prompted, not just filed in the category of things you once encountered, but actually carried, returning unbidden, surfacing when you're thinking about something else, it means your brain made a decision. At some level beneath conscious processing, it decided that this was worth keeping, that this belonged in the same category as real things that matter. Your brain doesn't make that decision about most fictional villains. It makes it about people, about experiences that left a real mark, about things you've actually been through. When it makes that decision about a fictional character, when it treats a villain with the same seriousness it reserves for real experiences, something unusual has happened. The character crossed a threshold. They stopped being information your brain filed under fiction and started being information your brain filed under truth. Evil Morty crossed that threshold. Rick Prime crossed it. And the question of how they crossed it is the question of what the perfect villain actually is. Here's the answer, stated plainly before we unpack it. The perfect villain is one who makes the audience feel something real about their own lives. Not about the story, not about the hero, about themselves, about the world they actually inhabit, about the questions they've actually been sitting with, the wounds they've actually been carrying, the fears they've actually been managing. When a villain connects to something real in the person watching, when the villain's philosophy resonates with a question the audience member has been unable to answer, when the villain's wound mirrors a wound the audience member knows, when the villain's desire for freedom or power or revenge or simply exit illuminates something true about what the audience member has wanted and either pursued or denied, then the character becomes personal. And personal is permanent. You don't forget what's personal to you. You can't file it away. It follows you. It surfaces. It becomes part of the ongoing interior conversation that runs beneath the surface of daily life. Evil Morty became personal to the people who know what it's like to exist in systems built for someone else. Rick Prime became personal to the people who know the specific pain of being hurt by someone who moved on without noticing. Rick C-137's grief became personal to everyone who has ever loved someone they were afraid to admit mattered. That's the whole of it. That's the secret. The perfect villain tells you something true about yourself. Now let's unpack why this is so hard to achieve, and what Rick and Morty did specifically to get there. The first requirement is specificity. The villain's truth has to be specific enough to feel real. A villain who represents generic evil, or general power-seeking, or abstract malevolence. That villain might be threatening in the plot, but they don't connect to anything specific in the audience's life. They're too general to land personally. Evil Morty is specific. His situation, born into a role that was defined before he existed, in service of someone else's centrality, with his own intelligence and desire and capacity entirely subordinated to the needs of the system that produced him, is a particular configuration of a particular kind of experience. Specific enough that people who know that configuration recognize it. Immediately, in their bodies, before their brains have processed the logic of the connection. Rick Prime is specific. The thing he represents, being hurt by someone who has already moved on, who doesn't remember doing it, who wouldn't recognize the weight of what they caused even if you put it in front of them, is a particular kind of pain with a particular shape. People who have known that pain recognize it in Rick's grief before the show articulates it directly. Specificity creates recognition, and recognition is the beginning of the personal. The second requirement is that the truth the villain tells has to be a truth the audience is already living with. Not a truth they're learning for the first time. Not new information being delivered, but something they already know. Something that's been sitting in them, unresolved, not fully articulated, that the villain suddenly makes visible. This is the experience of recognition rather than discovery. The difference between encountering something foreign and seeing something familiar named. When Evil Morty destroys the central finite curve, the people for whom that moment lands most heavily are the people who already knew, somewhere in their experience, what it felt like to want out of something constructed to contain them. The show isn't teaching them that feeling. It's naming it, giving it a shape, making visible something they were already carrying. That's why the reaction to that moment isn't just narrative satisfaction. It's something more personal, something that involves the audience's own life rather than just the story. And named things can be examined in ways that unnamed things can't. A feeling that was ambient and formless becomes, once named and shaped, something you can actually think about, something you can turn over and consider and learn from. The villain, in this function, is giving the audience tools for understanding their own experience. Not intentionally, the villain is doing what they're doing within the story. But the effect of the specificity and the recognition is that the audience comes away with something useful, something they can apply. That's why they remember. Because they're not just remembering a fictional character, they're remembering a moment of clarity about something in their own life. The third requirement is that the story has to take the villain seriously enough to let them be right. Not right in their methods, not right in their choices, but right in their analysis, right in the underlying diagnosis that generated the behavior, even if the behavior itself was wrong. This is the part that most storytelling refuses. Because letting the villain be right feels like endorsing them. Like the story is saying their position has merit, and for storytellers who are uncomfortable with moral complexity, that feels dangerous. Rick and Morty is not uncomfortable with moral complexity. It lets Evil Morty be right about the central finite curve. It lets Rick Prime's existence reveal something true about what optimized intelligence without love produces. It lets Rick C-137's nihilism be a genuinely coherent philosophical position, even while the show demonstrates that it doesn't describe how Rick actually lives. None of this is endorsement, it's honesty. The difference matters. When a story takes a villain's position seriously, really examines it, really follows its logic, really lets it stand as a coherent view of the world, rather than dismissing it the moment the villain is defeated, the audience feels the seriousness. They sense that the story is engaging genuinely rather than performing engagement, and they engage genuinely in return. That genuine engagement is what produces the personal connection. You can't connect personally to something you're being asked to dismiss. You can only connect to something you're being invited to actually think about. Rick and Morty invites it. There's a moment I want to return to, because it's been present throughout this documentary, and it's worth making fully explicit at the end. The moment is not a specific scene. It's a quality that certain Rick and Morty scenes possess, the scenes featuring its greatest antagonists at their most fully realized, that is very difficult to achieve and very easy to recognize when it's there. The quality is weight. Some scenes are weightless. They happen, they're entertaining or funny or dramatic or impressive, and then they're done. They move the plot forward. They do what they need to do, and then they're gone, and you're ready for the next one. Some scenes have weight. They happen, and something settles. The story shifts slightly on its axis. You feel the change as much as you understand it, and the scene doesn't leave immediately. It lingers. You carry it out of the episode and into whatever you do next. It's still there an hour later, still there the next day. Weight is hard to manufacture. You can't impose it through dramatic music or slow cinematography or any of the surface tools that stories use to signal importance. Those tools can signal that a scene is supposed to be weighty. They can't make it actually weighty. Actual weight comes from truth. From the moment connecting to something real in the audience's experience, from the scene doing what the best fiction always does at its best, showing you something true about being a person in a way that you didn't have before and that you can't put back. The eye patch scene has weight, not because of the production design or the music or the dramatic framing, because of the implication. Because of everything that small image suggests about intelligence and patience and the systems we build to feel safe and the minds that see through those systems. The moment Evil Morty steps through the portal has weight. Not because of the visual, it's a person walking through a door, because of what the walking means, what the leaving represents, what the freedom, finally achieved at this cost, by this person, from this specific cage, tells you about the desire to exist outside of structures that were never built with you in mind. Rick's grief, made visible and given a face in the Rick Prime arc, has weight. Not because the backstory is surprising, it's a familiar shape, a family lost, a life derailed. Because of the specific way the grief was caused. By someone who wasn't even trying to hurt Rick. By someone who moved on before Rick finished falling apart. That specificity of cause is what gives it weight, the particular shape of the wound, not its existence. Let's think about what it actually means for a villain to be perfect. Perfect doesn't mean flawless. Evil Morty is not flawlessly constructed. There are things about him the show left unresolved that some audiences found frustrating. Rick Prime's arc has seasons where his presence is more structural than active, where he functions more as an ambient dread than a specific threat. Perfect, in the context of storytelling, means something more specific than without flaw. It means that the villain achieved what a villain is for, not what they're conventionally said to be for, providing opposition to the hero, driving the plot, being defeated in a satisfying climax. What they're actually for, at the deepest level of what storytelling is trying to do. A villain is for forcing the audience to examine something. Something about power, or freedom, or love, or grief, or the specific ways systems shape the people inside them. Something that the comfortable, ordinary flow of the story without the villain wouldn't require examination of. The villain breaks the surface. The villain insists on the question, and the perfect villain insists on a question that the audience was already carrying. A question whose answer they didn't have. A question that the story, through the villain, finally gives them the language and the shape to really ask. Evil Morty insists on the question, who built the system you're living in, and who did they build it for, and what would it mean to exist outside of it? Rick Prime insists on the question, what do you do with grief, caused by someone who never knew they caused it? Rick C-137's entire character insists on the question, what does it cost to love people in a world that keeps proving love is dangerous, and is the cost worth paying? These are the questions the villains leave behind. Not when they die or escape or are defeated, but now, in the ongoing life of every person who has spent time with this show. The questions are still running. There's something about Evil Morty's exit in particular that contains the whole of what makes Rick and Morty's approach to antagonism different. He walks through the portal and he doesn't look back. That's it. That's the whole of it. In visual terms, a figure passing through a frame into light and not turning. The not looking back is doing so much work that it's almost invisible as a choice. Of course he doesn't look back. Looking back would imply a relationship to what he's leaving, some unresolved connection, some lingering investment, some part of him that's still in the Citadel, still in the constructed multiverse, still in the story. He has none of that. He got what he came for. He's leaving. Whatever is behind him is behind him. And Rick, our Rick, the Rick we've followed, the Rick who has been changing across all the seasons and carrying all the losses and being altered permanently by everything the show has put him through, Rick watches him go. That image, that specific composition, someone leaving without looking back, and someone watching them leave. That's the whole of what we've been exploring, made visual. The villain who is complete in themselves, pursuing their own story, not defined by their opposition to the protagonist. The hero who is changed by the villain's existence in ways the villain isn't even aware of, because the hero was never really the point of the villain's story. They shared a universe for a while. The villain rearranged some of what the hero thought they knew, and then the villain left. Without the confrontation, without the reckoning, without the scene that would have made it feel like a story rather than a thing that happened. Because that's what real things feel like. Things that actually leave a mark. They don't come with the scene that makes them comprehensible. They just happen, and you're left with what they left behind. There's a version of this documentary that ends with a definitive statement, something clean and memorable. A sentence that ties everything together, that gives you the thesis in a form you can carry forward and quote and feel satisfied by. That's not the right ending, because the whole argument of this documentary is that the most powerful things in storytelling resist that kind of closure. That the questions a great villain raises are better than the answers a resolved story provides. That the lingering is the point, the haunting, the persistence, the thing that follows you out of the fiction and into the rest of your life. A tidy conclusion would undermine everything that came before it. So instead of a conclusion, here's a reflection. Rick and Morty made villains that people are still thinking about years after watching them. Not because the show is exceptionally clever. It is. But cleverness alone doesn't produce this. Not because the animation is beautiful or the dialogue is sharp or the plotting is intricate. All of those things are true, and none of them is sufficient. Because the show was honest. Honest about what it feels like to want out of something that was built to contain you. Honest about what a person becomes when they optimize all the way and remove the friction of caring. Honest about the specific, irreversible damage that indifference causes. Honest about grief as something that shapes rather than resolves. Honest about love as something that persists even when you'd rather it didn't. That honesty is what the audience connected to. Not the multiverse, not the science fiction. The honesty about being a person, about what that costs, what it produces, what it requires of you in the face of systems and losses, and the particular kinds of damage that people cause each other when they're running their own calculations, and you happen to be in the way. The villains were the sharpest expression of that honesty. Because villains, by definition, have less to perform, less to protect, less of the social scaffolding that most characters maintain to function within a story. They're running on what they actually believe. And what they actually believe, in Rick and Morty's case, was always something true. Not something good, not something endorsable, but something true, and truth delivered with specificity and patience and the discipline to not explain what doesn't need explaining. Truth, given the space to breathe and the time to accumulate, is what crosses the threshold from story into memory. From memory into thought. From thought into the ongoing interior conversation that runs beneath the surface of your life, whether you're aware of it or not. Evil Morty is somewhere in the unconstrained multiverse right now, in some sense that the show made real enough to feel. Rick Prime was what happened when the most extraordinary mind in existence decided that other people were variables. And Rick C-137 is still in his garage, still drinking something he probably shouldn't, still carrying what he carries, still, despite everything, here. Still connected to people he loves and won't admit he loves and would do almost anything to protect. Still the version of himself that chose the friction, that kept the complication, that paid the price of being someone who feels things in a universe that keeps demonstrating that feeling things is dangerous. Still the answer, imperfect, damaged, self-defeating, occasionally magnificent, to the question his greatest antagonists posed. What is intelligence without love? He's looked at the answer directly. He's chased it across the multiverse. He's watched it walk through a portal and not look back. He knows. And the knowing is what makes him worth following. Not because he's the smartest, not because he wins, not because the grief resolves or the damage heals, or the questions find their answers, because he stays. Because he loves people, badly and secretly and at great cost, in a universe that was built without any particular interest in whether that love survives. Because the love survives anyway. And that, finally, is what the perfect villain teaches. Not how to be a villain, not how to build a better scheme or a sharper philosophy or a more elegant exit. What's worth staying for? What's worth being the complicated, contradictory, grief-carrying, love-concealing, occasionally magnificent mess of a person you are, rather than the clean and optimized and utterly empty alternative? The villains showed us the alternative. And Rick, carrying everything he carries, staying anyway. Rick showed us why we don't take it.